public health system, and our economy. The government's economic managers, through the Development Budget Coordination Committee, said that the GDP likely contracted by 8.5% to 9.5% in 2020. It also caused a high unemployment rate with 3.8 million pesos, with 3.8 million Filipinos still unemployed last October 2020. Further, the pandemic resulted to an alarming decline in the many economic sectors such as in tourism and accommodation, manufacturing, construction, transportation and storage, and a steep drop in OFW remittances by as much as 19.2%. Last May 2020, according to the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. While the country recuperates from the effects brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a need to supplement catalysts in order to hasten our recovery. The rollout of the national vaccination program is significant but will be insufficient to heal the economic wounds caused by this pandemic. As these current issues come to light, however, this does not overshadow the deep-seated societal and economic problems which have held back the country for more than 3 decades and which may be traced to the restrictive language in some provisions of the 1987 Constitution. Professor Gerardo P. Sicat, Professor Emeritus of the UP College of Economics, pointed out that the nationalistic provisions adopted by the 1987 Constitution from the 1935 Constitution were formulated in anticipation of the country's future political independence from the United States of America. However, the conditions existing then are not necessarily present now. As previous attempts will show, initiating discussions towards amending the Constitution is fraught with many challenges and issues. However, no matter how difficult and painstaking it may be, this representation sincerely believes that it is not just a timely endeavor, but a just and worthy cause. It is for this reason that Senator Francis Tolentino and this representation filed resolution of both houses number 2, which aims to hasten the recovery of our economy. Relaxing the requirements for entry of foreign investments will make our country attractive to investors. With high investment in local industries, our country will recover faster from the recent economic loss and ensure inclusive and sustainable development. More businesses shall equate to more job opportunities for our fellow Filipinos. We do not intend to just settle for band-aid solutions to our country's rising unemployment, but rather a long-term solution that shall not only boost our economy, but also uplift the lives of our people. Others would say that it's not a good time to amend the Constitution because of the existence of pandemic. However, it is my humble opinion that because of the existence of pandemic, the more it is necessary to consider again the discourse on relaxing restrictive economic provisions in the 1987 Constitution to rapidly revive and revitalize our economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator De La Rosa. May we just remind all our resource persons as well as our colleagues to keep their microphones in mute unless they will be speaking. We now call on Senator Tolentino to give his opening statement. You have the floor, Senator Tolentino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing us to have an opening statement. I indeed prepared an opening statement, and I'd like to thank the committee for allowing the public hearing of our resolution, including the resolution filed by Senator Lacson yesterday. This is my opening statement, which I prepared. We, the sovereign Filipino people. The preamble of the 1987 Constitution starts with these 5 words as a vision for the succeeding provisions of the fundamental law of our land. This phrase, we, the sovereign Filipino people, does not only put forth the direction for our Constitution, it also affirms our identity as a citizenry. Historically, and we all know this, we have had 6 constitutions, 6 the Proclamation of Independence on June 12, 1898. We continue to flourish as a nation with a strong tradition of constitutional government. The Malolos Constitution, the first Philippine Constitution, is in fact the first Republican Constitution in Asia. This morning, again, I'd like to reiterate my thanks. We convene as a committee to hear all the resolutions filed for charter change, albeit virtually and during a time of public health crisis, to exercise our constitutionally mandated power and discuss resolutions on possibly introducing amendments to our Constitution. The resulting document, if ever, after the conclusion of this exacting process, will determine how the powers of sovereignty will be exercised. Yet in so doing, we have to be cognizant of the fact that the Constitution is not just a body of rules and maxims. Every principle, section, and article in the Constitution is animated by the sovereign will of the people. This principle is perfectly resonated in our Constitution's Declaration of Principles. I quote, sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them, unquote. That sovereignty resides in the Filipino people is best exemplified in providing the people a system of initiatives and referenda in the Constitution, whereby they can share in some aspects of direct democracy. It is likewise the sovereign will of the people that Congress is given the authority to propose any amendment to or revision to the 1987 Constitution. The powers of government have been delegated to the members of Congress by the people who possess original sovereignty. The Congress is therefore the nexus between the Filipino people and their aspirations and will not, and I hope will not, fail them. We cannot fail the 109 million Filipinos seeking economic progress. Naiiwan na po tayo, hindi lang po sa buong Asia, kundi sa ASEAN, especially in this time of global health crisis. It is in this light that this representation, together with Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa, seeks to introduce amendments that will ensure that our economy is free from the external controls, yet responsive to the current needs of the people and adaptive to the global landscape. Time and again, the framers have exemplified that the Constitution is not about the current administration, a specific group or class, or a personal political agenda. It is about the 109 million Filipinos in whom sovereignty resides. It is about the Filipino people whose democratic values and ideals we should represent and take into account. In amending the Constitution, we have to be mindful of the inalienability of the Filipino sovereignty, lest we fail to fulfill our sworn duty to the Filipino citizenry. It is a great responsibility indeed just to convene this committee hearing to tackle proposed changes or even the mode or even the voting that would bring systemic safeguards to the present Constitution. However, amending the Constitution is not a task that should be taken lightly. We all know that. It is one, if not the most challenging and solemn duties of Congress. We will be crafting, if ever, not just a document containing the fundamental law, but a document that embodies the rule of law and represents the sovereign will of the Filipino people. When the 1987 Constitution provided that any amendment to or revision of the Constitution proposed by Congress or a constitutional convention, and I quote, shall be valid only when ratified by a majority of the votes cast in the plebiscite, unquote, it is a recognition that it is the people who will ultimately decide the fate of our Constitution. And it is a humbling reminder to all of us in Congress and even the resource persons, which I respect all present here, that when we exercise our constitutional power to sit as an assembly, if ever that happens, to propose amendments to or revisions to the Constitution, we only do so because that power has been delegated to us by the Filipino people. Allow me to quote, Mr. Chairman, some provisions from the Pennsylvania registered centuries ago, which I think is apropos. Our constitutions, the truth is that in our government, the supreme and absolute and uncontrollable power remains in the people. Our constitutions are superior to our legislatures. So the people are superior to our constitutions. Indeed, the superiority in this last instance is much greater for the power for the people possess over our constitution, control in act as well as in right. The consequence is that the people may change the constitution whenever and however they please. This is a right which no positive institution can ever deprive them. True power resides in the people, and the people is the fountain of all power. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, dear colleagues, for allowing me to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Tolentino. Would there be other senators who would like to give their opening statements? In that case, we can. Oh,
Senator Francis.
yes, Senator Gatchalian. Go ahead, Senator Gatchalian, for your opening statement. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Pangilinan. First of all, let me thank you for hearing this resolution. In fact, my resolution's number is Resolution of Both Houses number 1. And I filed this last July 11, 2019, even before the pandemic, because I believe that our country needs to unleash its full potential, being restricted by our very own constitution. I'll give you a very specific case in point, wherein education can be a very good potential and also unleashing the knowledge capital of our country. But now we are under the pandemic, and you threw a very important question earlier in your opening statement, where is the timing right to tackle the amendments or revisions in our constitution. My opinion here is if we restrict our amendments to its economic provisions, I think the same line of thinking wherein we can use the potential of the country to hasten the recovery of our own people. You're right, you're absolutely correct that unemployment is a very big problem here in our country. A lot of our OFWs are returning without any jobs and also finding themselves without any jobs here in their own country. And I would like to hear from our economic managers, especially experts in the economy, on how our proposals on amending our economic provision can be used as a tool to generate jobs, to generate investments, and to help our people recover as fast as they can. The pandemic has become a game changer. In fact, I've been monitoring our neighboring Southeast Asian countries. Vietnam has truly overtaken us in terms of investment and job generation. The pandemic has regressed our potential and our economy by many years. And that's why I'm here to listen to our economic managers and to find out whether these proposals can be used as a tool to jumpstart our recovery eventually. So once again, thank you very much, Senator Pangilinan, for hearing this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gatchalian. If there are no other senators who would like to give their opening statements, we will now proceed with our recognition of our resource persons. Just a point of information, for purposes of orderly and organized proceedings, we have divided actually the discussions into two. The procedural aspect, which will be tackled today, and then we will discuss lengthily on the substantial aspect, which would include the economic provisions, federalism, parliamentary form of government, among others. Of course, we will not prevent any of our colleagues to raise questions on whether procedural or substantive matters, but we are just appealing that for organized and orderly proceedings, this will not be the last hearing. And therefore, we will appeal that we focus on as much as we can on the procedural aspect of charter change today, and we can raise and focus on the substantive aspects of charter change in the next hearing. Senator Amy Marcos, please, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman Pangilinan. It's merely a point of information. I am here as the secondary committee and chair of the economic affairs and not of electoral reform. Thank you, and we eagerly await the input of our economic managers and other experts.
We thank you for that clarification, Senator Marcos, and we stand corrected as chairperson of the Committee on Economic Affairs. We can now proceed to the resource persons. May we request the committee secretary, Attorney Seng Palinas Mactal, to introduce and place on record those resource persons who are present.
Thank you, Your Honor. We acknowledge the presence of the following resource persons: former Supreme Court Associate Justice Honorable Vicente V. Mendoza, former Associate Justice Supreme Court of the Philippines Honorable Adolfo S. Ascuna, member of the Consultative Committee to Review the 1987 Constitution, Father Renhilio Aquino, from the DOJ, Chief State Counsel George O. Ortha II, from the DILG, USEC Jonathan Malaya, from the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, Dr. Rosario Manasan, Dr. Marife Ballesteros, and from the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Sec Gen Ruben Pascual and Ms. Anya Cruz. May we remind the resource persons on keeping the mute button unless it is their turn to speak or deliver their position papers.
Okay, thank you, Attorney Seng. We can now proceed. We have the program flow. We will ask our resource persons to present their position papers responding to the 3 earlier questions. They have 8 minutes each, and after which we will give our senators the chance to raise their questions after the presentations have been made. We've also arranged that the presentations will be based on their positions, for, against, depending on their answers or to the questions, so that we can have a full presentation of all sides to the issues. And so we can proceed. We begin with the position and the presentation of former Supreme Court. Before that, for the information of our colleagues and our resource persons, we had invited Chief Justice Puno of the Puno Commission, but he is unavailable. We hope to be able to have him in the next hearing. We also invited Chief Justice Davide. He initially confirmed, but a medical emergency he had to address a personal emergency, and therefore he cannot join us today. He would like to join us in the next hearing. So we can now proceed. We acknowledge and give the floor to former Supreme Court Associate Justice V.V. Mendoza, my professor in constitutional law at the UP College of Law. Justice Mendoza, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question here is really one of priority. We all agree that because of the pandemic, we have suffered a great devastation of our economy, not to speak of the loss of lives. And with respect to economic recovery, I don't think there is any question that we need economic aids and whatever we can get in order to recover. So it's a question really of priority. But I submit, Mr. Chairman, that whether it is to liberalize what allegedly have been considered restrictive economic provisions, or to abolish the party list system, no more urgent need can prevail over two challenges I would consider the greatest that we should give our attention to and commit all our energy and resources to meeting these two challenges. These two challenges, Mr. Chairman, are the threat of the COVID pandemic, and number two, the preparation of our people for voting wisely to choose those who will govern us for the next 6 years. Good government is as urgent and a challenge as anything I can think of. Now, the economic recovery can take place after this. Aid for economic recovery can take place after this. But first, we have to meet these two challenges. The pandemic has already claimed the lives of, 10,242 lives as of Sunday, January 24. And yet, we still don't have a clear schedule of when vaccination can take place. Questions are still being discussed in the Senate with regard to the acquisition of suitable vaccines. What are we going to do with this unless we first answer these questions?
Yeah, I got it.
Number two,
I'm on.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, number two, the education of the people. Wait a minute. The education of the people for wise voting and the preparation for clean, honest, and credible elections that can spell good government in this country demand the patriotism of everyone. And we need to summon all our will to bring that patriotic spirit back to the people. These are two challenges that we have to confront before we can speak of any other change in the Constitution. As the proposal is to hold the ratification of the proposed amendments together with the next elections in May of next year, just 15 months away from now, this problem of confronting these twin problems will be greatly complicated. So we are having this problem. And not to be discounted is the worry that a constituent assembly or even a constitutional convention can become a runaway assembly or convention that will not limit itself to the consideration of economic problems. There is simply no way of stopping a runaway assembly or convention. For these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I do not believe this is the time for charter change, given, number one, the threat of the pandemic, and number two, the great challenge of securing in this country good government. And that is tied to the next elections, national and local. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Mendoza. We were hoping you would respond as well to the two other questions so that we can complete your presentation. Should the amendments be by CONCON or CONAS, Constituent Assembly? And then if Congress convenes as a Constituent Assembly to amend or revise the Constitution, should the Senate and the House vote jointly or separately?
Actually, as we know, proposals to amend the Constitution can be made by, number one, the registered voters, I think 12%. Number two, by Congress acting as a constituent assembly. And number three, by constitutional amendment, by convention. Now, if we go by historical precedent, you will see, Mr. Chairman, you will recall rather, that we have adopted constitutions via a constitutional convention. In 1935, when we wrote the 1935 Constitution for the Commonwealth government, and eventually for the Republic of the Philippines. In 1973, when we established a parliamentary system of government, and in 1987, when following the overthrow of the Constitution then existing, we adopted, following people power, the present Constitution. So, since we are not adopting a new Constitution, a Constituent Assembly seems to me to be suitable, less expensive, since it will not involve the election of delegates, and number two, already there in place. It's a matter of converting. But then there's a problem of converting the Congress into a constituent assembly. And that's going to be my discussion for the third topic. Do you want me to proceed to the third question?
Yes, please. Yes, please. And please proceed.
Yes. Now, deciding to do constitutional change through the method of constituent assembly will raise again two vexing problems which have been with us since the start or effectivity of the present Constitution. Question number one, should the two houses of Congress meet in a joint session, or should they meet separately in physical terms, whether the House of Representatives can transact business at the Batasan building, while the Senate transacts business here at the Reclamation Project? That's question number one, whether they should meet jointly or separately. Number two, in voting, how should they vote? Separately, as they vote when they are enacting ordinary legislation, or jointly, as if they are assembled in the same session hall, but voting separately. With respect to the question of should they meet in a joint session, my submission, Mr. Chairman, is that they should. Because when they meet as a constituent assembly, they're not meeting to legislate as Congress. As the Supreme Court pointed out, the senators and the congressmen act not as such senators and congressmen, but members of an assembly. And indeed, the subject of their meeting is not to pass ordinary legislation, but to discuss the fundamental law of the land. In the terms of Marbury versus Madison, forgive the descent to pedantry, the Constitution is not an ordinary law. It is a superior, paramount law, unchangeable only by a special method, not subject to ordinary legislative bills. To treat, therefore, the Constitution as if it were simply a statute or an act of Congress that has to be amended with the two houses sitting separately and voting separately is to violate the dictum that we all know as members of this Constituent Assembly. Number two, Mr. Chairman, there are 5 instances when Congress performing non-legislative functions is required by the Constitution to meet in joint session assembled, but to vote separately are the following. Number 1, to declare the existence of a state of war. Number 2, to canvass the votes for president and vice president and to proclaim the winner, or in case of a tie, to break the tie. Number 3, when there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president during the term for which the vice president is elected, and the president nominates from among the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives who is going to be the vice president, his nomination requires confirmation by Congress sitting in joint session but voting separately. Number 5, question of presidential inability. If the president declares to Congress he is unable to discharge the functions and office of the president, we all know that upon the receipt of such written declaration, the vice president assumes the office of the functions and duties of the president in order to provide continuity. Or if the president does not do that, if a majority of the cabinet sends a written declaration to Congress that the president is unable to function as president, the vice president becomes the acting president. But if the president subsequently declares or announces to Congress that he is already fit and is going to reassume the office, but the cabinet disagrees with him, that dispute between the president and his cabinet as to the physical fitness of the president will have to be resolved by 2/3 members of Congress in joint session assembled, voting separately. In all of these instances, which are non-legislative functions of Congress, just like the performance of its highest non-legislative function of changing the Constitution or calling a constitutional convention, Congress is required to meet in joint session and to vote separately. Why vote separately? Because Congress is a smaller body which can be easily overwhelmed or outvoted by about 290 members of the House of Representatives. For that simple reason, Mr. Chairman. But otherwise, they function not as senators, not as congressmen or representatives, but as one member of a constituent body meeting face to face in a public discussion of fundamental issues. This, I submit, Mr. Chairman, are reasons for believing that in a constituent assembly, the two houses of Congress must meet in a joint session but vote separately when issues are raised. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Justice Mendoza. We now proceed to the DILG Undersecretary Malaya for your presentation. Please proceed, Undersecretary Malaya. You have the floor.
I'm sorry, did not get that question.
We will now proceed with another resource person, Justice Mendoza, and then the questions of the senators will follow. And thank you for your presentation, Justice Mendoza. Please make yourself available later on as questions may be raised in the duration of the hearing. May we have, yes, Senator Drilon, go ahead.
Yes, just as a matter of record, the chair may want to place of record the presence of the former delegates to the Constitution.
Oh, yes.
I see them.
Yes, we have former Commissioner Christian Monsod of the CONCOM, as well as former Commissioner Florangel Braid of the CONCOM. Thank you for joining us. Is Jonathan Malaya ready for his presentation? If he is not ready, we can ask who is next online. Is the Department of Justice ready? The Department.
Yes,
Yes, please proceed. The resource person from the Department of Justice, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Senator. We don't have any PowerPoint presentation, but we have submitted our written comments to the joint resolutions. I hope the committee was able to receive it, Mr. Senator. So essentially, considering that the joint resolutions involve the revisions on the economic provisions of the Constitution, we stated in our position paper that we support the move to liberalize the economic provisions of the 1987 constitutions. But of course, this is without prejudice to the economic manager's position, Mr. Chairman, which we believe they would be in the best. They are in the best position to say the timing of the amendments. Although we've been involved in the core, as will be presented earlier by Yusek Malaya, and we've been supporting the amendment with respect to the economic provisions, among other, Mr. Chairman. As regards the mode of amendment, it was already mentioned earlier by former Justice Vicente Mendoza, who was the chairman when I took the bar, Mr. Chair. We support his position that there are various modes, and of course we defer to the good senators and even the members of the House of Representatives whether they prefer to have a constitutional convention or a constituent assembly. But taking note that the resolutions would focus on the economic provisions, a constituent assembly might be preferred, Mr. Chair. We also agree that the voting should be separately, Mr. Chair, and not jointly, although the Constitution is silent on the matter. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to George Orta. He is Chief State Counsel George Orta II. Maraming salamat for your manifestation. Okay, si Yusek Malaya is now on board. We will allow you the opportunity now to make your presentation. Yusek Malaya, go ahead. You have the floor.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Senate President Tito Soto, Chairman Kiko Pangilinan of the Senate Committee on Constitutional Amendments, and all of the senators present this morning. I apologize for the technical difficulties that arose, but once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind invitation to our department. Mr. Chairman, we received the invitation and we prepared a presentation.
Please go ahead.
Next slide, please. The first question propounded to us, Mr. Chairman, is there a need to amend or revise the 1987 Constitution given the COVID-19 pandemic? Next slide. I'd like to begin, Mr. Chairman, by discussing the situation of the country during the ECQ. The NEDA estimates that the ECQ over Luzon for just 1 month resulted in a loss, a gross value added of 298 billion to 1.1 trillion, equivalent to 1.5 to 5.3% of gross domestic product, and that is expected to reduce employment from 61,000 to almost 1 million. Next slide. Given the situation, Mr. Chairman, of the economy, we'd like to present the level of citizen-based restrictiveness in the Philippines is quite evident. It can be seen here in this graph from the Department of Finance, which shows that the country was the most restrictive globally, as well as just within the region. Number one in both cases in terms of foreign direct investment, regulatory restrictive index as of 2014. Next slide. In his study, former Secretary Gary Olivar from the Foundation for Economic Freedom and a former professor of finance at the Asian Institute of Management calculated that the foreign direct inflows as a percentage of GDP for 9 out of the 10 ASEAN countries using 10-year data from the World Bank as of 2018. As you can see, Mr. Chairman, we have one of the lowest FDI investments as percentage of GDP in the ASEAN. Next slide. In terms of world competitive rankings, Mr. Chairman, the Philippines clearly lags the entire ASEAN region in the relative size of its FDI inflows. over the 10 years up to 2018. We lag not only overall, but also in each and every category of infrastructure surveyed. Next slide. So when we compare the Philippines with Vietnam, Cambodia, and Singapore, we can see that our net inflows as a share of gross domestic product has decreased. Definitely, the Philippines has lagged behind our ASEAN neighbors, which are less restrictive. Next slide. So, Mr. Chairman, the President created the Inter-Agency Task Force in Constitutional Reform in 2018, and the Department of Interior and Local Government was made the chairman of that task force, with the Department of Justice as the vice chairman. And we have been studying the lifting of the restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution since 2018. Let me summarize a little bit, Mr. Chairman, the results of the findings of the said task force. Given the impact of COVID-19 in our economy, removing the restrictive economic provisions would be a significant factor in revving up the economy and sustaining our recovery from the pandemic. In yesterday's hearing, Mr. Chairman, of the House Committee on Constitutional Amendments, Secretary Dominguez of the Department of Finance said that the lifting of the restrictive economic provisions would allow us to have an adaptable economic policy regime at this crucial period in our nation's history, rather than being tied down to a fixed set of policies. Next slide. Also, in the same hearing, Mr. Chairman, it is the consensus of the IATF Core that for the country to be able to fully recover from the pandemic, we must open up the economy to achieve a truly inclusive, investments-led economic growth that will create more jobs for our people. We submit, Mr. Chairman, that the current restrictive economic provisions make it harder to create jobs for our countrymen. It restricts Philippine competitiveness, as we have seen in the slides I have shown. The restrictions are outdated and inflexible, and the Philippines, as shown, is one of the most restrictive countries in the world. We submit, Mr. Chairman, that removing the restrictions will allow the Philippines to obtain the benefits of foreign direct investments the soonest possible time. It is the position, Mr. Chairman, of the IATF Core that lifting the restrictive economic provisions, together with the enactment of other laws like the CREATE Bill, amendments to the Public Service Act, the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and other economic measures will be an effective combination to increase our country's competitiveness and surpass the levels of FDI achieved by our neighbors. Next slide. On the second question, Mr. Chairman, proposed by the committee, should the amendments or revisions be proposed by a CONCON or by Congress itself sitting as a constituent assembly, and why? Next slide. Our position, Mr. Chairman, is that the experience of older democracies in the world is that legislative action through a constituent assembly of both houses of the legislature proved to be the most expeditious manner to effect changes in the Constitution. Legislative action as a mode of constitutional reform did not disrupt the continuity of their political and constitutional systems. For instance, Mr. Chairman, the United States did not convene a constitutional convention every time they wanted to amend their constitution, and they have made many amendments in the course of their history. In France, members of parliament propose amendments to the constitution, as do many other countries. And in our jurisdiction, Congress is also given by the Constitution the power to effect changes through a constituent assembly. Next slide. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, in practice all over the world, constitutional conventions are not meant for amendments, but are convened by Congress for the purpose of drafting an entirely new constitution, on the assumption, of course, that the existing charter must be changed wholesale. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, a constituent assembly would be the preferred, ideal, and proper mode to lift the restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution as proposed in the bills currently pending in the Senate today. As to the timeline, Mr. Chairman, we leave it to the wisdom of Congress, but we propose that the referendum on the proposed amendments be done simultaneous with the 2022 national elections. Next slide. As to the last question proposed given to us by the committee, if Congress convenes as a constituent assembly, should the Senate and the House vote jointly or separately? Next slide. Our position, Mr. Chairman, is we support the position of Speaker Lord Alan Velasco and House Committee on Constitutional Amendments Chairman Alfredo Garbin that the Senate and the House should vote separately. We believe this is the case, Mr. Chairman, because the bicameral nature of Congress makes separate voting logical, prudent, and reasonable. As clearly explained by the great constitutionalist Father Joaquin Bernas, and I quote, "It is also submitted, however, that what is essential is that both houses vote separately. That is because the power to propose amendments is given not to a unicameral body, but to a bicameral body." In conclusion, therefore, Mr. Chairman, since Congress is a bicameral body with separate membership, leadership, and rules, it therefore stands to reason that they should vote separately. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to submit our comments to the to the Senate Committee on Constitutional Amendments.
Thank you, Yusek Malaya. We can now proceed with Justice Ascuna. Justice Ascuna is also a former member of the Constitutional Commission of 1986. You have the floor, Justice Ascuna, and you have 8 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the Senate, fellow consultants, and friends. Good morning. I proceed to answer the 3 questions of the Honorable Senate. First, I think it is high time we address the need to amend the restricted economic provisions of the Constitution, precisely because of the negative impact of the pandemic on the economy. I leave the timeline to Congress. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that addressing the restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution should be a part of the solution to the impact of the pandemic on our economy. If we try to solve the economic impact of the pandemic without addressing the restrictive provisions of the Constitution, it's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back, Mr. Chairman. Furthermore, there is a need to align ourselves with the ASEAN countries in the so-called ASEAN integration. And there is a barrier to ASEAN integration in the form of the restrictive economic provisions of our Constitution. So we cannot fully utilize the available tools for economic recovery if we do not address the restricted economic provisions of the Constitution. Finally, Mr. Chairman, as a member of the Constitutional Commission that drafted the present Constitution, I believe that we intended the economic provisions to last not more than 5 years. The 5-year period, Mr. Chairman, is contained in another provision which says that the Constitution cannot be amended, cannot be revised by referendum, by plebiscite, by initiative within the first 5 years. We wanted the Constitution to be untouched, really, for 5 years, including the economic provisions, to see if it works. After that, since economic provisions should be flexible, I think we should address the need to adjust them to changing times. But only the economic provisions, Mr. Chairman, because the rest of the provisions of the Constitution are meant to be bedrock principles that embody the ideals of our people. So when we proceed to amend the Constitution, we have to be very careful that we do not excise those provisions that are meant to protect our people for a permanent basis. For instance, I noticed, Mr. Chairman, in the proposed resolution pending before the Senate, provisions to the effect that the state shall protect the nation's marine wealth in its archipelagic waters, territorial sea, and economic zone, and reserve its use and enjoyment exclusively to Filipino citizens, unless otherwise subsequently provided by law. I submit, Mr. Chairman, that this is the wrong placement of the unless otherwise provided by law. Because then a law can provide that the nation's marine wealth and archipelagic waters will no longer be protected by the state. So you have to be careful where to insert this unless otherwise provided by law. So how should it be inserted? It should be inserted this way. The state shall protect the nation's marine wealth in its archipelagic waters, territorial sea, and exclusive economic zone, and unless otherwise provided by law, reserve its use and enjoyment exclusively to Filipino citizens. That is what the law, the Congress can do. Change the 60-40, but not change the directive to protect the marine wealth of our country. So it is very important when you tinker with the Constitution to tinker knowledgeably, Mr. Chairman, and to know where to put this very important provision unless otherwise provided by law. I was the one, Mr. Chairman, who proposed this originally to Speaker Belmonte as a way of making our economic policy flexible. But when Speaker Belmonte said, okay, I will file a resolution to that effect, and then when he tried to do it, he called me up again. Adol, mahirap pala gawin ito. Saan natin ilagay ito unless otherwise provided by law? So I said, you have to be very careful. So I sent him my draft, and it was on the basis of that he proceeded to submit his resolution, both houses, number 1. So when I review the present resolutions that are pending, the placement of that unless otherwise provided by law is misplaced in some cases, Mr. Chairman. So that's the point to remember, that the Constitution contains both bedrock principles and flexible provisions. We should just address the flexible economic provisions and not the bedrock principles to protect the state's patrimony and resources. The other question then I proceed to the Chairman is whether or not the Congress should act as a Constituent Assembly, or these changes should be done by a Constitutional Convention. If the only change that we will effect at this time is to remove the restrictive economic provisions, there is no need to call a Constitutional Convention. It can be done very simply by resolutions of both houses, pass 3/4 vote by the lower house, 3/4 vote by Senate, and then presented in the plebiscite. Doesn't even have to be signed by the president. So very simple. There's no need for a constitutional convention. It can be done by Congress. The other thing is Congress should limit itself to only the economic provisions. Otherwise, it won't be simple. It will take more time. It should be done by a constitutional convention. So that is my submission. Can it be done? Can we limit Congress to this only? Yes, because of the procedure. You can do it through like a legislation, filing a bill. So you limit the subject matter of the bill to the economic provisions only. That way we'll really just address this problem and remove or make flexible the provisions on the economy found in the Constitution. As to whether Congress should vote separately or jointly or meet jointly or separately, I agree that because of the bicameral nature of Congress, they should vote separately. I agree with Justice Mendoza that they should meet jointly, because the idea here is on very important issues. The members of the Senate and of the House should hear each other, share each other's wisdom, but they should vote separately because they are constituent members of the Constituent Assembly, Senate and House of Representatives. If you read Article 6, the Constitution has to be read as a whole, not only the provision on amendment, but also the provision on the legislative body. The Congress consists of Senate and House of Representatives. So when we say that Congress, by a vote of 3/4 of its members, it means 3/4 of the Senate and of the House, because the members of Congress are Senate and House, Article 6. So that is my opinion, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully submit the same and open myself to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Ascuna. We now proceed to former Commissioner Christian Munsod for his 8-minute presentation. You have the floor now, former Commissioner Munsod. Go ahead, please. You have to unmute. Yes, you are muted. You have to unmute your laptop. You are still muted. There you go.
Okay. I may go over it. The heart of our Constitution and its most compelling principle is social justice and human rights. The promise of EDSA of radical social change has not been fulfilled by any administration since EDSA. We're the laggards in our part of the world on mass poverty and inequality, rooted in a feudalistic system of political dynasties and its companion evil, corruption. Therefore, the ends of legislator must be to address these twin problems with the correct means. It is the ends that drive the means and not the other way around. And it's not enough to be sincere. You must also be correct in what we do. I submit that we are failing in this regard, not because of the Constitution, but because we have not fully implemented it, especially its provisions on social justice and local economy. Any changes in the Constitution must be towards this vision, and the means must include the two compelling principles of the Constitution, namely, never again to any authoritarianism, and the economy must safely and firmly be in the hands of Filipinos themselves. If the life of the law is experienced, then we have the experience of martial law and amendments to the 1935 Constitution on parental rights for Americans as examples, both of which resulted in economic disasters. There have been 5 previous attempts to change the Constitution. The Ramos Pirma, the Project Accord of Mr. President Estrada. In 2001, the attempt to have a French version presidential parliamentary. In 2006, Sigaw ng Bayan of the Arroyo administration struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. In 2009, a proposal by the Arroyo to give an equal vote for congressmen and senators, which we are discussing now. In 2015, the House initiated JR1 with almost exactly the same provisions on the economy as RBH2. All of these past attempts were unsuccessful because the people perceived the articulated purposes as a smokescreen for self-serving ends. The articulated purpose of RBH2 is similar to previous attempts. Quote, provide decent living conditions to the people, transform this economic growth into inclusive and solidarity progress among Filipinos. In other words, development defined as high growth rate plus equitable distribution of its benefits. But unlike previous attempts, the context of RBH2 is different with the pandemic and a shattered economy. But RBH2 changes that by using outdated data. In the preliminary note, the growth RBH refers to is 2010-2017, before the pandemic, although already declining even before the pandemic. Citing only the good news and suppressing the bad is a recurring theme of this administration. The fact is, for 2020, when all countries were experiencing a slowdown, Philippine economy was one of the worst performing, if not the worst, in Southeast Asia. And the Philippines is also the worst performing among East Asian neighbors in the handling of the pandemic. The evidence on growth, the projected growth rate for 2020 by the IMF of East Asia are Myanmar 2%, China 1.9%, Vietnam 1.6%, Laos 2.21%, Indonesia minus 1.5%, Mongolia minus 2%, Cambodia minus 2.8%, Malaysia minus 6%, Thailand minus 7.3%, Philippines minus 8.3%. As to the pace of recovery, both the IMF and World Bank projections is that it will also be the laggards. The evidence on the pandemic, the Lancet Commission report to the UN General Assembly ranks countries according to the handling of the pandemic. Out of 91 countries, the Philippines came out 66 on the number of new cases per day per million population. Most of our neighbors are in the top 10 with Indonesia ranked 28. We are the worst in ASEAN with 66. The reason? The IMF said limited and unimplemented fiscal stimulus. In other words, wrong analysis, incompetent implementation. Is there a relationship between lives and livelihood? According to a UP study recently that correlates the fall in GDP growth in 2020 from 2019 across 21 countries in ASEAN, East Asia, including Australia and New Zealand, quote, stronger national capacities to detect and respond to emerging outbreaks are associated with better economic outcomes in 2020, and moreover, that improvements in certain capacities, such even as laboratory systems, may matter more. RBH2 articulates the real motive for RBH2, just like previous attempts, is power and money. RBH2 is also supported by the business community. The motive of the businessman is not the country either. That's just the rhetoric. The real motive is profit. RBH2 is dangerous and devious because it's a wholesale transfer of power from the Constitution to the Congress on determining the limitations of foreign ownership of land, natural resources, public utilities, media, advertising, educational institutions. Once the phrase is inserted, the constitutional provisions become meaningless, and the door is open wider to corruption or transactional legislation, at which corrupt politicians and greedy elite beliefs are very adept at doing. Remember Hacienda Luisita and the law that allowed landowners to distribute shares rather than land. Remember how the banking system, unlike in successful Asian countries, which forced it to serve development goals, was allowed alternate compliance with the mandate to devote 25% of their portfolio to agriculture, where we were allowed to buy T-bills instead. Remember the underfunding of asset reform programs, or TRAIN that reduced taxes to the rich, or the bill intended to correct the pro-mining law in 2015 that quietly died in a committee in the House. Above all, RBH2 is a new and bigger source of illicit money than the pork barrel. Look at it this way. Once the insidious insertion is accomplished, our legislators can go to rich foreign land developers or mining companies and ask, by how much do you wish to increase your ownership of land and mine? From 40% to 51, 50 billion. 67%, 100 billion. 75%, 150 billion. 100%, 200 billion. That's loose change. The biggest mining project in Tampakan, South Cotabato, cost $6 billion or 270 billion. The total mineral deposits in our country is estimated at 1 trillion or 45 trillion pesos. That's what's stake with RBH2. These are the numbers. Today, to change ownership percentage, the economic provision, the House must muster 217 votes and the Senate 18 votes. Once the insertion of this phrase is made, the constitutional provisions, the Congress only needs enough votes as in ordinary laws to change the percentage on ownership. In theory, 73 votes in the House, 7 votes in the Senate. RBH2 is also insidious because it is made to appear to be harmless and is being represented as only giving Congress flexibility to make actual changes at an appropriate time. But it sets a bad precedent in trivializing our Constitution and forecloses debate at this time because no specific changes are being proposed on the foreign equity caps. They say, don't worry, when the actual numbers are proposed, the people, through Congress, will still be the ones to decide. The only issue today on the table, they say, is a harmless insertion of one phrase. Given our experience with corrupt legislators and greedy elite business on transactional legislation, are we willing to entrust our legislators with that kind of power, especially since theirs is so much more money from rich foreign investors and the poor don't have any money? Why foreign direct investment? Advocates say that restrictions on foreign ownership stifles the investment climate, resulting in lost employment and growth opportunities, and that such restrictions are therefore anti-poor. The latest move of Congress argues that foreign investment fosters competition and will therefore result in fair pricing of products or services. Of course, this does not apply to natural monopolies like transmission and distribution of electricity. Our present problems of inefficiency and overly high returns rise from regulatory capture or cartels, even where there are more than one participant. Will allowing the entry of foreign investors with majority or full control of a company address these problems, or just raise the price of transactional legislation and regulation? The truth is closer to what Professor Emeritus Michael Mayer of Wharton School pointed out in Business World article in 2014, that the ethos of capitalism is you operate for your shareholders rather than for the whole people. Quality of investment. Another argument for opening our doors fully to FDI is that any investment is worth attracting because, quote, at least they contribute something and everything helps. But the empirical evidence is clear. FDI does have a role to play in development, but what counts is not the quantity but the quality of the investment. And to determine quality, we need to make a full accounting, not just of its benefits, but also of its costs, including what economists call externalities, and also take account of such long-term considerations as brownfield or greenfield investment, its contribution to raising the trajectory of our technological development, and downstream plans from our minerals that increase the value added in the country. The mining industry has been promising that for the past 30 years. We don't have industrialization up to now on our natural resources. Inequality. It's no longer debatable on economic theory that a sustained high growth rate is necessary for poverty alleviation, and that growth does not result in development without an equitable distribution of its benefits. Inequality is now a major issue, even in developed countries. 2 days ago, January 25, Oxfam issued a statement based on data from Forbes 2020 billionaires list that the Philippines' 13 billionaires have seen their wealth increase by 637 billion since the pandemic began, enough to give 11 million poorest Filipinos cash of 58,136 pesos each. What they term as inequality virus, the 1,000 richest people on the planet, including the 13 Filipino billionaires, managed to recoup their COVID-19 losses within 9 months. However, it would take more than a decade for the world's poorest to recover from the economic impact of the pandemic. The wealth increase of Filipino billionaires is a stark contrast to the record high hunger that millions of Filipinos felt during the pandemic. With increased food and travel transport prices, we're seeing the country comes increased starvation and poverty. So what is Congress doing about the worsening inequality? It prioritized legislation and reduced taxes to business, including those of billionaires, instead of a wealth tax, and it's promoting RBH2 as the most urgent legislation at this time of the epidemic. And more than the constitutional restriction, should we not be concerned with the benefits of growth and labor productivity are not shared with labor? Between 2001 and 2016, real GDP per capita more than doubled at 5.4% a year. Labor productivity also increased by 57% between 2005 and 2015. However, real wages did not move. Aggregate real wage remained for 15 years. It remained flat for 15 years, with 7 of the 15 registering a negative growth rate. With the pandemic, that has become worse. What is Congress doing about that? It's no longer debatable in economic theory that a sustained high growth rate is necessary for poverty alleviation, and that growth does not result in development without an equitable distribution of its benefits. As for the role of FDI in development, here are some findings. Number one, macro-level data may show an association between foreign direct investment and higher levels of income, but they do not establish causality. Similarly, no generalization can be made between the activities of foreign firms and income distribution. The question remains unanswered. Does FDI cause growth, or does growth cause FDI? Historically, FDI played only a minor role in the growth of high-performing Asian economies. From 1966 to 1986, their fastest growth period, FDI was more than 5% of total gross domestic investment only in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. Countries where FDI was less than 2% of GDI were Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and China, the tigers. More recently, except for China and Singapore, FDI is less than 10%. On the factors that affect nations according to the World Investment Report and others, what are the factors that affect investment decisions? Adequate infrastructure, skill levels, quality of the general regulatory framework, clear rules of the game, fiscal determination, graft and corruption, criminality, and political instability. The fact is that if we conscientiously attend to these factors, we may have more foreign direct investment, but on our own terms. The World Bank does not put lifting restrictions on reserve areas for local control as a priority condition to attract foreign direct investment. They know that it is a fact of public policy in most developing countries, as it was for developed countries when they were themselves developing. Who would benefit the most from RBH2 other than legislators and business? Even assuming there is some benefit from FDI, this is the worst time to patch such an amendment because FDI will consist only from the Chinese, with Western economies experiencing surges of pandemic and economic shutdowns and have neither the resources or the time to engage in investments. China is already recovering and will largely monopolize FDI. Is this what we want? They're already getting favored tax and entry treatment. connected politicians and Chinese businessmen have already received smuggled vaccines from China. And the next targets of China are mainly land, natural resources, and public utilities. They are already in the management of transmission. Who suffered the most from corruption? The poor, fishermen, farmers, indigenous people, even the urban poor, because the LGUs have sold to big business engaged in loan banking because malls, shopping malls are already obsolete. What exactly are subject to unless provided by law? Of course, Article 12, Section 2. Section 13, ownership and also the lease of agricultural lands, because of the positioning of the phrase, also the term of the lease, presently 25 years, and the size of the lands, presently 1,000 hectares. Unless otherwise provided by law, Congress can extend the term beyond 25 years and increase the area by as much as 1 million hectares, as proposed by the Arroyo administration to produce food to be totally exported to China. It was withdrawn later as unconstitutional. Article 12, Section 7, the exception of hereditary succession allows an ownership is subject now to all exceptions with otherwise provided by law. Article 12, Section 10, ownership, but why the need for a phrase in the section which only gives Congress the power to increase the 60%? Section 11, participation of foreigners in the governing body of public utilities limited to proportionate capital. And because of the placement of unless otherwise provided by law in the provision, foreigners can have 100% of a governing body, even with 1% of the capital. Article 14, Section 4, Paragraph 2, applies not just on the ownership of educational institutions under the first sentence, but also control and administration of educational institutions, presumably even without ownership, because unless otherwise provided by law, applies only to the second separate sentence on control and administration. Are these carelessness or intentional? Restrictions. Have we really closed the door for FDI, especially on land, natural resources, and public utilities? Leases are allowed up to 50 years, with another 25 on public land. Condominium laws allow ownership of residents. Actually, any project that relies on windfall rent of land for its viability is invariably a bad project. There is more important dimension to land in our culture. Unlike in the US and Europe, where land is just another economic commodity, and because of the history of colonization and injustices related to land, land is not just an economic commodity in the Philippines. It's a social asset. We cannot talk about land rights in the context of Western culture and Western legal maxims, because to the poor, land represents their emancipation into mainstream society, hence social justice and agrarian reform. Even the foreign chambers of commerce admit that lifting land restrictions may raise land prices beyond the reach of the poor. Those who argue for equal ownership lies to a foreigner on the ground that he cannot bring land out of the country just don't get it. A study in 2019 by Wharton School professor on the success of countries on growth, comparing monarchies where the king or queen is head of state and government, not government but head of state, and comparing monarchies and republics based on three standards: protection of private property, limited executive tenure, and presence of checks and balances in government. And they found monarchies more successful. Incidentally, President Duterte is pictured as among the heads of government that are not performing well. Incidentally, the countries that have conflicts on property are those with inequitable distribution of land. Public utilities. Under EPIRA, only natural monopolies are public utilities, transmission and distribution. Power generation and retailing can be foreign owned.
Chairman, Commissioner Monsol, how much time do you still need? Because
About 4 minutes.
Okay, and then you can wrap up. Go ahead, please.
When we had generating problem, why were foreign interests not investing? Because it's not only about ownership restrictions, they only wanted long-term take-or-pay provisions. And of course, on natural resources, we have the Labugal case of the Supreme Court. On media, the issue of content has been overtaken by technological development. On advertising, the separation of creative work from advertising function appears to work. On educational institutions, well, we all know that we don't agree with that because our educational institutions should not be allowed controlled by foreigners. To summarize, amending the Constitution is not likely to open any new doors to FDI because for all intents and purposes, they're already open. For quality FDI that we want to attract, it is more critical to address the real hindrances cited by the World Investment Report and ADB report, which creates a favorable investment climate, not just for foreign direct investment, but for domestic investments as well, which accounts for 90% of total investments in the country. As for RBH2, it's not the answer to anything. Like previous attempts at charter change, it's just another exercise on taking and the use of political power for serving ends, and it should not be allowed to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Monsod. For the information of our colleagues, we still have a few more. Father Aquino has requested that he be allowed to speak because he has to leave. And of course, we have a few others, but we will adjust. If there are questions that are to be raised, we can allow a few questions already, and then have those other resource persons who have not been able to speak to also be able to respond immediately to those questions that have been raised, so that their opening statements can be incorporated with the responses.
Sir, good morning, sir. Dads po. Sir,
We have
update ko lang po kayo. Actually,
Ms. De Jesus, your line, okay. Father Aquino, you have the floor, and then after that, we will allow questions from our senators, and then we will prioritize answers from resource persons who have not been able to speak, so that we can somehow accommodate and merge the resource persons' inputs and the questions of our senators. Go ahead, Father Aquino.
Good morning, Your Honor. Good morning, Your Honors, the members of the committee, and other members of the legislature present. I am honored to be on this distinct panel. I am particularly enamored by the very frank and honest presentation of Commissioner Monsod. I confined myself, Your Honor, as instructed, to merely the procedural issues, and I will be very happy to contribute my paper later on to the substantive issues when they are taken. For now, allow me to address the three questions that were posed to me in the letter of invitation. When is the proper time to revise or to amend the Constitution? The proper time is whenever it is determined that one provision or the other of the Constitution makes it difficult for the body politic to respond to challenges that may arise in the degree to which a meaningful response is demanded. In short, any time that there is a genuine need to revise or to amend is the proper time, even 1 year before a national election. It is necessary to point this out because whenever the proposal to amend the Constitution or to revise it arises, there is always the objection that now is not the propitious time. While I understand that the pandemic has lent urgency to the need to amend, the amendments, I respectfully submit, must look beyond the pandemic, because we are amending not merely to cope with the pandemic, we are amending the fundamental law of the land, and we should look beyond the pandemic. We are rewriting the Constitution, if we are dead set on doing that, not only to allow us to face the pandemic, but to allow the body politic to adapt to the demands of circumstances. But I think, and I respectfully beg to be pardoned for this position, I think it is catering to a dangerous fancy to believe that our financial woes will be solved by amending the economic provisions of the Constitution. I am honest about one thing. I'm honest about not concealing my disappointment over the fact that in 2018, I was a member of a committee constituted by the President to study the 1987 Constitution in view of proposing a draft that he could submit to Congress that would revise the Constitution, principally to put in place a federal system. We had very great respect for the 1987 Constitution because we thought it was a very good Constitution, and our principle was not to change it where it did not be changed. The proposals we made took us several months to study. We conducted hearings, deliberated, often acrimoniously. But Congress did not seem to have much interest in charter change then. So why now? If it, as has been loudly professed, the purpose is to liberalize the economic provisions of the Constitution, was this supposed need not already felt long before 2021? I will not, however, accept the pretext that our concern with COVID-19 and whatever mutations might have arisen and will yet arise should be the main reason that we do not have charter change. After all, a pandemic of this kind may be with us for a very long time, and the business of government cannot grind to a halt completely, not even centrally concerned with pandemic only. The Republic must cope with the challenge, and one sure way that it hurdles difficulties is by functioning effectively and efficiently. If our legislators were not confident about a draft that our committee took all of 6 months to write, with the members of the committee working exclusively on the task at hand and meeting every day from morning to evening, should we be more confident about a draft that will be hammered out by an already overworked and overloaded legislature? If then it is the purpose to amend merely 1 or 2 provisions of the Constitution, then there is still enough time to do it. But I must once more ask, what provisions urgently need amendment that they could not have been amended sooner or the job put off for a later time? Just how broadly will the amendments go? A revision calls more certainly for a very thorough job. It is a change in the basic orientation of the Constitution, an overhaul of the Constitution. It is my position that Congress, setting out on this task, cannot do a good job of revision, considering the effort and the time that must go into a revision. The resolution introduced by Senator Richard Gordon, Senator Win, and HB R number 2 consists in leaving to Congress by subsequent legislation the liberalization of certain restrictive provisions of the Constitution and eliminating the all-Filipino restrictions set forth by the fundamental law for such concerns as the advertising industry and the mass media. These 2 proposals certainly lie within the realm of the feasible or the doable. My concern lies in the quality and exhaustiveness of the study that supports and opposes such proposals. Do we have sufficient credible studies that show us the benefits or point to the pitfalls of these proposals, not only in the years to come, but for future generations as well, given the volatile situation of the economy in this part of the world and the expansionist tendencies and capabilities of some of our very aggressive neighbors? Second question, Constitutional Convention or Constituent Assembly. If the plan is to revise the Constitution, then I am thoroughly in favor of a Constitutional Convention on condition that the criteria for selection of members and the non-partisan character of the convention be earnestly safeguarded. This is because a constitutional revision calls for so thorough a job that it cannot be just one of the many concerns of Congress. The amount of research that goes into revision is prodigious, and the debates must be unfettered by political allegiances and alliances. While we are on the topic of Constitutional Convention, all that the Constitution requires is that two-thirds of its members decide to convoke a constitutional convention. There is no requirement that the convention consist of elected delegates, although we elected the delegates who drafted the 1935 and the 1973 constitutions. The 1987 constitution was drafted by a thoughtful but hand-picked group of commissioners. But the difference, of course, was that there was really no constitutional provision in place that determined the modes of amending or revising the charter of the land. Without meaning any denigration or slur on the honorable members of Congress, the fact is that by its very nature, Congress is a partisan body. What we need when drafting a revision of the Constitution are persons with a solid grasp of constitutional theory, coupled with a more than cursory idea of what the country's political system needs. I am fully aware that my presentation has been limited to the procedural issues, but let me just invite the attention of the committee to the fact that the 2018 committee to study the 1987 Constitution, that was chaired by retired Chief Justice Renato Puno and co-chaired by former Senate President Aquilino Pimentel, did wrestle with the issue of the liberalization of economic provisions. In the end, we preferred a conservative position, keeping very close to the provisions of the 1987 Constitution, fearing that unless we trod carefully, we would wake up one morning to find most active enterprises in the Philippines in the hands of the nationals and entrepreneurs of neighboring megalithic economies, and the alienable land and private lands in the hands of their nationals as well. This was a prospect we dreaded. Third question, voting jointly or voting separately? The ambivalent phraseology of the Constitution reads, the Congress, upon a vote of 3/4 of all its members, may propose amendments or revisions to the Constitution. It is a provision like this that amendments must clarify. And even before the economic provisions, all uncertainty spawned by provisions such as this should be cleared by amendment. I had occasion to ask one of the framers once what they meant by this and why they came up with such an unfortunate draftsmanship of this particular provision. The answer was rather simple. They had thought all along that they were going for a unicameral legislature. But when at the last minute they decided to keep a bicameral Congress, they forgot to return to those provisions that contemplated a legislature with only one chamber. This is the same ambiguity we find in respect to the martial law provisions that provide that Congress, voting jointly by a vote of at least a majority of all its members, revoke the proclamation of martial law. Does that mean that if the votes of the lower house are sufficient, Senate may be ignored? That is not clear. It is my persuasion that since Article 17, Section 1 uses the term Congress, and Article 6, Section 1 clearly provides that Congress shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, then Senate and the House of Representatives must vote separately. This reading, I respectfully submit, upholds the policy supporting a bicameral legislature. I conclude with a reminder that the ultimate sieve will be the sovereign people through a plebiscite, and who for this reason should be informed at every turn of what fortunes or misfortunes befall the fundamental law of the land. Thank you very much, Your Honors.
Thank you, Father Aquino. We will adjust our schedule. We have had resource persons presenting for almost 2 hours. We will now accommodate the questions from our senators, but with the understanding that our resource persons who have not been able to speak will be allowed to react and be given the floor to respond, should they wish, to the questions raised by our senators and provide their inputs Before we proceed with the questions from the senators, of course, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the other co-author, the other author of resolution of the on charter change. Senator Gordon is here. We also have the Senate President Pro Temp, Senator Recto, and we have former Senate President Coco Pimentel also. And so we can now proceed with the questions to be raised by our colleagues on the basis of our practice. We will allow the officers first, and then by order of appearance, the other senators may follow. And so we first give the floor to our Senate President for his questions. The Senate President has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Instead of posing questions on the substance, because I understand that you will be taking it up at a much later time, and there are other proposals that I've heard from the business community, particularly the Wallace Business Forum Group has had a proposal that we should perhaps take a look at. But in as much as you have concentrated on really the first portion, which is on the House, on how how we go about it, I have no difficulty, and I have no problem with any of the manifestations presented. Indeed, it is correct. We vote separately. The Constitution mentions voting separately, perhaps I think 3 or 4 times. And only once has it mentioned that we vote jointly, and it's only in the case of martial law. So I think that issue is resolved, definitely. And hearing from Speaker Velasco and the Majority Leader and the Chairman of their Constitutional Amendments Committee, they agree. So that is already a solved issue. On whether it's a con-con or a con-ask, correct. What I've been hearing is I agree with most of what I've heard. So I leave it to that. I will ask for your the floor again, perhaps in your next hearing or later, when we go to the substance of the proposals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the Senate President. We will now allow the Minority Leader to raise his questions. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just like the Senate President, I will not ask many questions now. Allow me time to review the transcript, the testimony in detail, because there's a lot of substantive arguments raised. And, later at the later hearing, I can raise these questions. But as of this moment, I just have a few questions. Like the Senate President, I note that almost all the resource persons are of the view that we should be voting separately. And I particularly note the position of the DILG and the DOJ. I think it is realistic to assume that this matter, that this matter could ultimately end up in the Supreme Court, as it is asserted that for whatever reasons there is some vagueness in provision. Now, as I said, I noted with interest the position of the DOJ and the DILG that we should be voting separately. May I know if that is the opinion of the executive branch?
So may we request Yusek Malaya to respond, and then also from the DOJ's Chief State Counsel Ortha. You have the floor, Yusek Malaya. It looks like Yusek Malaya is he on? If not, we have Attorney Chief State Counsel Ortha. Can you respond to the question of the Minority Leader?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, Senator Drilon, but I'm not in a position to say that it's the stand of the executive, although I can confirm that that is the opinion of the Secretary of Justice because I discussed this matter with him.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that that is the opinion of the Secretary of Justice. However, I would also like to hear the opinion of the Solicitor General, because ultimately he will be the one to argue this before the Supreme Court, and he has often asserted that he is the tribune of the people, and therefore, from that statement, it would appear to me that he is not necessarily bound by the opinion of the Department of Justice or the executive branch. Of course, he has gone up. Of course, he has been chastised recently by the Supreme Court on an overuse of that provision, of that principle. But having said that, not to belittle the opinion of the Secretary of Justice, because the Secretary of Justice is in fact the lawyer of the Philippine government, and under the administrative code, his opinion is binding on the executive branch. But nevertheless, but I'm interested. Would the Chief State Counsel Ortha be able to spread on the record the opinion, if he knows, of the Solicitor General?
I am not aware of any, Mr. Senator.
May I suggest to our chairman that maybe the Solicitor General can be invited to the next hearing if he may want to share his opinion with us.
We will do so. We will make the necessary representations on behalf of the committee.
Just one more point. The advocacy is to liberalize the economy, and the theory is that the very restrictive provision of the Constitution necessitates an amendment. But if we note the amendment to read a simple addition to the economic provisions by adding the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law." Would the proponents of the constitutional amendments asserting that it is restrictive agree with me that it would still be up to Congress to liberalize the economic provisions, because it is precisely left to Congress whether or not to change the policy on certain economic provisions of the Constitution? Maybe can I ask, with all due respect, our most respected colleague, former Justice Ascuna. Again, my question is: would the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law" really liberalize the economic provisions of the Constitution, remove the restriction, but still would leave to Congress the issue of whether or not our economic policies should be liberalized, and not the Constitution itself?
Thank you, Mr. Senator. Mr. Chairman, in my opinion, the provision "unless otherwise provided by law" precisely renders the economic restriction in the Constitution changeable by legislation. But there's still need for legislation to change it. In fact, we could also provide not simply "unless otherwise provided by law." We can add "subject to reciprocity," for instance, and thereby requiring that Congress, in crafting the legislation, require reciprocity. You can put safeguards in the legislation by requiring Congress to adopt certain safeguards. For instance, you might require Congress to have a 3/4 vote to adopt a law that would modify the economic provisions of the Constitution. So it's up to Congress. It's not that simple, but yes, you need legislation to change. The other thing is, I noticed in the draft resolutions that there are provisions that are deleted. In addition to putting "unless otherwise provided by law," some proponents would delete certain provisions. I would not advise that, Mr. Chairman. We should limited to making these provisions changeable by legislation rather than already removing certain provisions now. That makes the amendment complicated. The purpose of the amendment is simply to make changeable by legislation the economic restriction. Thank you.
So that, Mr. Justice, unless Congress exercises that authority which will be granted to it by virtue of the amendment, the so-called restrictive provision of the Constitution will remain. Although there will be a debate as to whether or not they are restrictive, but unless Congress acts, the so-called restrictive provision will remain in force and effect. Would you agree with that?
That is correct, sir. Except that I see from the proposals that there are, in addition to this, unless otherwise provided by law, deletions of certain provisions. So those deletions will already affect removal of some restrictions.
All right. In Congress today, Mr. Justice, are at least 3 bills which intend to liberalize our investment climate. Number 1 is the amendment to the Public Service Act, which I authored. Number 2, the amendment to the Retail Trade Law, which I authored. The number 3, the passage of or the amendments to our investment laws, particularly the Foreign Investment Act, which is pending before the bicameral conference committee. Would you agree with me that these laws would liberalize our investment climate?
Yes, I would agree with you, Mr. Chairman, but only to a certain extent. It cannot go against the economic restrictions in the Constitution.
Yes, I agree with that. That may be a view, but in effect, the liberalization to that extent of our investment climate could be achieved as evidenced by these 3 very critical investment laws, which, if passed, have substantial effect on our investment climate, on our foreign direct investment, assuming that the FDI is a major power in our economy, which issue is disputed but my good friend Christian Monson. But in any case, there are 3 laws right now which seeks to liberalize without touching on the provisions of the Constitution. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, yes, there are strong arguments in favor of liberalizing our economy, but it can be achieved without touching, in the meantime, on the Constitution, because if we just talk about short-term investments, there is proof that we are doing this. And I am of the view that that amending the Constitution by adding the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law" is not the golden bullet which will bring everything in. That is why it must be deliberated carefully. And given the time that we have, I have my reservations about whether or not indeed this can be achieved. Because I would repeat, the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law," which appears to be the most convenient tool, will not bring the desired liberalization if we are talking about that, because Congress would still have to enact these laws. And right now, there are 3 pending bills, which on the short term can improve to a great deal our investment climate. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to express my views on this.
Thank you, Senator Drilon. With the permission of our colleagues, perhaps some of our resource persons who have not been able to speak can chime in and give their comments on the question raised by Senator Drilon, particularly our business sector representatives, Ms. Anya Cruz of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Goles of the PCCI, as well as the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and the resource persons. Are they on board? Are they are they willing to comment on the points raised or questions raised by Senator Drilon on the liberalization of our investment climate, as well as other related issues? Is Professor Manasan here? Or Anya Cruz? Go ahead, from PCCI.
Hi, sir. Good morning. I'm Anya Cruz. I would like to call the Secretary General of PCCI, Mr. Ruben Pascual, if he's in the room.
Yes, Mr. Pascual, you have the floor. Please, if you could respond to the question on liberalization of the investment climate, as well as other related issues affecting the business sector on the matter that is being discussed.
Sir, I don't think he is in the room. I'll just call him and then maybe...
Okay, in the meantime, can we have Professor Manasan? Ma'am, you're on now. Please feel free to give your inputs as well as your comments. Go ahead.
Good morning. On the to amend the related economic provisions of the Constitution to attract foreign investment, here are some points I want to raise. First, there is some merit to the proposals to amend the restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution on this matter. Numerous studies documented the foreign investment role in spurring economic growth and the income of host countries. Studies
Professor Manasan, Professor, you're very chatty. Perhaps you can turn off your video so that the signal might improve. Yes.
Okay.
Please proceed.
Okay. Studies have found also, particularly by the OECD, that restrictions on FDI in the Philippines are high both by regional and global standards, and that many of these restrictions are in fact enshrined directly in the Constitution. There are also other studies, the same study actually, that shows that the relationship between FDI restrictions and FDI flows or stocks normalized for market size is highly negatively correlated with each other. However, it should be emphasized that correlation does not imply causality. Next, a World Bank study in 2014 highlight the following findings. It shows that both cross-country and cross-sector data indicate negative and statistically significant relationship between foreign ownership restrictions and FDI inflows. However, the same study shows that the explanatory power of foreign ownership is low, indicating that other factors are also at play. In particular, other studies have indicated that these other factors include macro instability, corruption, high cost of power, and poor infrastructure support. Finally, let me cite another study that was prepared as a background paper for an ADB 2016 study, which found that the quality of governance is the most important factor that explains the flow of FDI in developing countries. In contrast, FDI restrictive policies of developing countries or host countries were not found to be significant in restricting FDI inflows in these countries. Note that this study, let me just try to make this short. What are the factors included or the components of governance included in the study? Because this appears to be the most important determinant of FDI flows. So included under the governance quality are the following factors: political stability, absence of violence, government effectiveness, which captures perceptions of quality of the civil service and degree of its independence from political pressures, and the credibility, and I think this is very important, the credibility of government commitment to such policies. So this is what economists would call policy consistency over time. It also includes regulatory quality, capturing, which refers to perceptions of the ability of government to formulate and implement sound policies. There's also rule of law, which refers to the extent to which investors have confidence in the rules of society, particularly as it refers to quality of contract enforcement, i.e., sanctity of contracts. And then finally, control of corruption. So the question is there a need to amend or revise the Constitution as it refers to the restrictive provision of its restrictive provisions right now? I think the answer here is definitely no. Amending the Constitution now to liberalize restrictive economic provision is ill-timed. First, it heightens the risk that more controversial amendments will also be introduced, very much like a Trojan horse. Second, as pointed out above, liberalizing this restrictive FDI provision is not urgent. The statistical power of foreign ownership restriction in explaining FDI flows is found to be low, indicating that other factors are also at play. And finally, doing so now distracts legislators and policymakers from the more urgent task at hand, addressing the health and economic decline brought about by the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Manasan. We now have Senator Recto as one of the officers to proceed with his questions, after which we will have the other senators by order of their appearance.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is PCCI on board to be able to respond to the earlier question? Otherwise, we will now proceed to the who was next? Senator Villar. Is Senator Villar on? If Senator Villar is not available at the moment, Senator Marcos. The order of appearance is Senator Villar, Marcos, Gatchalian, Bato, Tolentino, Gordon, and Pimentel. So is Senator Marcos available? If not, we proceed to Senator Gatchalian. Is Senator Gatchalian on? Is this Mr. Pascual of PCCI? You may wish to respond and give your inputs before we call on the next senator to raise his questions. Go ahead, Mr. Pascual. Good afternoon. Mr. Pascual just disappeared. I mean, there. You are muted. There you go. Go ahead, Mr. Pascual of the PCCI. Nawala. Okay, we now proceed to Senator Bato de la Rosa. Senator Bato have questions. Senator Bato is not around. Senator Tolentino.
Just a manifestation, Mr. Chairman, and with all due respect to Commissioner Monsod, perhaps there was a slight mix-up when he alluded to RBH number 2 and RBH number 1, but it's immaterial at this point. One manifestation relative to the presentation made by my former professor, Professor Ascuna. It's appreciated that you mentioned that the original intent was to have that 5-year period as to the economic provision. Am I correct, sir, Professor?
Senate, yes, go ahead, Justice Ascuna.
Yes, you're correct. That's my opinion only.
So that would now be tantamount to giving Congress the power to make suitable amendments after an appropriate period lapsed, especially as to the economic provisions. Again, that's my question, Professor, for clarification.
Yes, the Constitution has been in effect for about 30 years already. The economic provisions should not have lasted more than 5 years unchanged, in my opinion.
Thank you, Professor. I have no further questions. I also appreciate your comment relative to the placement of the phrase "unless otherwise provided for by law" in that specific provision relative to marine resources, among others. So, is it the preference of my professor, Justice Ascuna, that that phrase, "unless otherwise provided for by law," is a better terminology rather than the sentence provided for in the various amendments coming from the American Constitution, a typical example of which reads as follows: "The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provision of this article." I am referring now to Amendment number 14. Amendment number 15 in Section 2 likewise states, "The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation," and so on and so forth. Would that mean now, because of the flexibility granted by the Constitution to Congress, I'm referring now to the Philippine Congress, the better phrase would be the "unless otherwise provided for by law," but placed in the proper context. Is that the correct assumption, Professor?
Yes, Senator, Mr. Chairman, I believe that the placement of the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law" is very critical because we don't want to take away, as I said, the protective principles that should continue. It's just the percentage of ownership that should be flexible, but not the principle of protecting our national resources and marine resources.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. May we just also, for the inform our resource persons who have not been able to speak, please feel free to raise your hand and call my attention if you wish to respond to some of the questions raised by our distinguished senators. Perhaps Commissioner Braid, would you have any inputs? And then we will call Commissioner Monsod. Ma'am, you have the floor. After which we will call Senator Gordon for his questions.
So, hello.
Go ahead, ma'am. You are muted, ma'am. Please unmute your mic, ma'am.
Yeah. My position regarding the amendments or revisions remains the same now as it was before the pandemic. And therefore, it supports the arguments of some of our commissioners, Commissioner Monzo, that no amendments, no revision. And should there be a clamor from the people that indeed there is need to amend or revise the charter, my preference, and I believe is also the will of the people, is for a constitutional convention rather than a constituent assembly. This stand had been expressed as the popular will, and I believe public opinion had not changed. Here are my arguments. One, a matter of trust and confidence. Presidents Ramos, Estrada, and Arroyo wanted to introduce revisions, but they failed because people thought that the initiatives were guided by self-serving motives. Up to this time, this perception remains. Many think that the Constituent Assembly will not merely focus on introducing the 5 words that we have been talking about now, unless otherwise provided by law, but that it would open the floodgates and more revisions will be added, including extension of terms. Our honorable senators propose amendments of restrictive economic provisions on land, natural resources, mass media, educational institutions, advertising, or amend the public service law, which would lift restrictions on foreign equity ownership on some sectors classified as public utility. Incidentally, as we all know, Secretary Dominguez argues that we should omit land. No? Third argument is that the period of pandemic is not the right time. Lifting the economic provisions will not affect the investment climate and generate the much needed investments and jobs to counteract the economic contraction caused by the pandemic, according to economists and experts. During a period of instability and because of need to focus on the pandemic, it may not be the right time to open the economy. Economist Role of Fdi believes that constitutional change will not create a tsunami of foreign investments. The high cost of power, electricity, and also the many steps to be taken as in starting business enterprises, the effectiveness of our judicial and legal systems, local peace and order situation are limiting factors, he noted. Informal surveys had shown that foreign investors are not as much bothered by the 60-40 ownership ratio as they are with corruption and other difficulties faced in doing business. I agree with Dr. Manansan's observation that it's the political environment that matters much, that credibility, trust, quality of governance, regulatory systems, civil service quality, these are very, very critical factors in limiting FDI flow. Finally, it may not be prudent to revise or amend a constitution that many of our countrymen do not fully understand. I think we know that surveys had shown that only a limited 30% understand the constitution. But then I think I'd like to show my opinion on some way forward. That our 34-year-old constitution has imperfections, or what some describe as pathologies or inconsistencies. So I agree that sometime in the future we have to revise it. I join many of our countrymen who realize need to amend or revise some provisions to relate it to changes in our global environment. But since this is in the right time, we must think of alternatives to charter revisions. There is consensus that we must devote our energies and limited resourcing in addressing the pandemic and to address critical challenges brought about by the contraction of the economy, such as growing poverty, hunger, malnutrition, unemployment, without amending the charter. One focus is how to assure authentic decentralization with innovations such as gradual transfer of resources from national to local government to increase productivity of the countryside, more resources for agriculture, which is the future of the country, or devolutionarizing Imperial Manila. Support of Balik Provincia schemes, building capability at local level, repairs of barangay and farm-to-market roads, building of health centers, hospitals, training of human resources, and stimulus for returning OFWs and agribusiness entrepreneurs. And support for the Supreme Court ruling, which reaffirmed in 2020, the petition of Batangas Governor Mandanas and former Bataan Governor Garcia, which stated that the era of LGUs must come from 2/5 of collections of all national taxes, including customs and tariff duties, thus increasing LGU IRA to more than 7 trillion in 2022 from 847.4 billion today. At present, LGU's era come from 40% of national internal revenue. Can you imagine if this is fed into the countryside and improving the economic climate of the majority of our countrymen? Finally, Congress, national and local governments, civil society, mass media, church, and business groups could come together in promoting understanding of the Constitution. It can start by celebrating Constitution Day on February 2, which is a week from now, the way other countries, including the United States, give importance to our symbol of statehood. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Braid. We now have a quick response from former Commissioner Monsod, and then we will have Senator Gordon's questions. Go ahead, Chairman Monsod. I think you have to unmute your mic. There you go. Go ahead.
I just want to take issue with my friend Justice Ascuna because I don't remember in the Constitution that we meant the economic provisions to last for only 5 years. Secondly, even today, the economists are saying that the 6-year development plan that our government does is too short. As a matter of fact, even President Duterte went as far as 2040. And if we are going to say that we can change our policies every 5 years, I don't think that will work. And I don't think that was the intent, nor was that arrived at during the Constitutional Commission.
Okay, thank you. We now have Senator Gordon. Is he ready? You have the floor, Senator Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify my position on the matter. I filed this bill as I filed it in the previous Congress, and the phrase otherwise provided for by law kind of limited my vocabulary because I thought we needed to do it fast. So far as I'm concerned, if we wanted to change the Constitution, the ideal thing would be to have it. And of course, there will be point and counterpoint here that the new president should be able to, encourage the Congress, make proposals of his own so it's transparent. The Congress can make proposals on its own at the beginning. But unfortunately, when we start doing it, like in previous years, at the latter part of the term of any president, it becomes subject to question and scrutiny, and as to the purpose, the real purpose of amending the Constitution. And so, therefore, I'd like to make it a record that I'm not in favor of amending the Constitution at this time. Principally because we need to focus on many things that we need to do. Not just the pandemic. We can handle the pandemic and amend the Constitution, but if you like, it will be very divisive, or it could be lead to other things. Now, my question in connection with this, as I've already stated my position, particularly to Justice Ascuna, I don't know if Justice Mendoza, my former professor in the UP, is still there. I think even Mr. Monsod can comment if he likes. Once you come up with a constitution, a constitutional body, whether it's a Constituent Assembly or a constitutional convention, would you agree that it attains a life of its own, practically becoming a co-equal branch of government, and that it can go sideways, forwards, and backwards with no interference? Would any of you care to comment on that?
A fourth branch. May we have maybe Justice Mendoza?
The question, can you repeat it, please?
Go ahead, Senator Gordon.
Sir, my esteemed professor, once you create a constitutional body that will amend the Constitution, and we have had exercises in that, we had a Constitutional Convention in 1935. We had one again in 1971, of which Justice Ascuna and I were part of it. We were all elected. And then you had what you might call the Constituent Assembly, whose members were appointed. Whether or not they were elected or appointed, once a constitutional process established with a responsibility being, posited upon a particular group, the Constitutional Convention, Assembly, or whatever attains a life of its own and cannot be controlled by the president or by Congress or until they finish. Would that be correct, sir?
I got it. Yes, the possibility of a runaway con or con us for that matter is always there, especially at a time like this when it is only 15 months away from the next election. The temptation to propose amendments like term extensions and the like, all geared toward the next election, is always there. And you cannot control the agenda of con us or con. That's the problem. A runaway constitutional convention or constituent assembly.
Yes, sir. Fairly or unfairly, it may be said that presidents are subject to suspicion. And like I said, fairly or unfairly. And that is why I believe, based on what you said, I'm now looking at the timing. Would it be right for us to come out with a process, for example, perhaps in the next election, whoever is running for president will say, I will amend the Constitution on my first quarter of my term, and these will be my proposed amendments, and all the other senators, etc., they can list it down. So the public will be more educated on where we're going, particularly on the right away from the very start. And I would prefer a constitutional convention in that case, in which there is a baseline upon which the Constitution can amend it. Otherwise, they can either amend, overhaul, revise, and there will be no timeline to it, which happened to us in 1971. Martial law interfered. We did a pretty good constitution, and the rest was finished by former President Marcos, rightly or wrongly again. I'm not passing judgment, except for the provision, the transitory provision, which was quite controversial. I thought the 1971 Constitution, and I like to hear Justice Ascuna's statement here, I thought that was good enough. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is, we must be transparent to the public. So from the very beginning, if you're going to amend, like in our case, in the 1971 Constitutional Convention, UP Law Center came out with a very, very thick book where they proposed parliamentary, presidential, semi-presidential, or semi-parliament. And the people were appraised. I don't think enough, but nonetheless, the delegates were appraised. But as far as I'm concerned, let us give credit where credit should be due. If a president feels that this has to be amended, or if the timing or the Congress feels that they can amend it, I think that it should be done early enough, preferably by a separate branch other than Congress. And I want to ask Justice Mendoza, would it be within the powers of this Congress, for example, to set a timeline upon which the Constitution will be finished?
Within the power of Congress to put parameters, they will always be overridden. They can always be overridden. Any kind of control you attempt to put to limit the agenda is not going to stand, cannot hold, will not hold. You can a member of Congress, or rather Constituent Assembly or CONCON, from proposing any subject that he wants to. I don't think he can be overruled.
So that means there will be no timeline imposed, and in which case I go now to another position. In the American Constitution, Congress amended them, with the First Amendment, if I remember correctly, which is freedom of expression, and then they went to the Fourth Amendment, which is freedom from unlawful searches, or even later on, the right to bear arms. Or for that matter, after the Civil War, they amended it insofar as assuring racial equality, which never got finished until now. It's in the word of the Constitution, but it's never happening. But would that be a better way to do it, Mr. Justice? To do it in part, maybe, and that is why I was very sparse when I said my vocabulary was limited to unless otherwise provided for by law. And I agree with former Senate President Ridon when he says it still be the Senate and the lower house elected by the people of this country who, by virtue of a constitutional mandate, says this is the general law, but we can make law to adjust, especially in this time of speed. In other words, we're not hamstrung. There is flexibility. Sir.
Yes, but not at this time. You see, any effort to tinker with the economic provision is subject to many dangers, Even this provision that Justice Ascuna mentioned about protecting the marine resources of this country and preserving them to Filipinos. That's a fundamental provision. And I hope that that will not just be limited, because that underlies one of the fundamental policies mentioned in Article 2 of the Constitution, that we should have an economy that is self-reliant and independent and controlled by Filipinos. So when you post that provision about marine resources, you're touching other provisions fundamental to the Constitution. Can you leave that to the politicians? I don't think we can do that. Those are economic provisions put there. Unlike the American Constitution, which has no economic theory, we have a constitution that is nationalistic. It was placed there from the start. And when it was submitted to the U.S. Congress, the 1935 Constitution, which was principally the work of nationalists like Senator Locsin, America did not object to these protectionist provisions. What it did after the independence was to seek parity amendments. which was also some fundamental change in the Constitution. Parity amendments is similar to tinkering with the economic provisions now. It gave American citizens and corporations owned by them the same
Equal rights.
Filipinos in the exploration, development, utilization, and use of the natural resources and operations of public utilities. What's that? That's a fundamental economic provision that does not only touch a particular provision, but several other provisions of the Constitution. I repeat, we have an economic theory underlying the Constitution, and you cannot just change the Constitution without debating on the economic theory underlying our Constitution. American Constitution has no economic theory. Holmes said that.
Yes, sir. You're saying, of course, that there's a political philosophy, a moral philosophy behind the American Constitution. And that I said this when I was still very young, when I was in the Constitutional Convention not too very long ago, when we said the Constitution cannot be seen as a panacea for the country. It's a fundamental law of the land. This is a philosophy of a nation. And I agree with you that when you start arguing on economic principles, they are really ephemeral. Economic issues change as the years go along. But I personally believe that Congress would be better suited to it. I mean, we don't want a rigid constitution that every time you want to move away from it, you have to amend the Constitution. And I agree with you. I agree with that principle, sir. Having said that, the fact that the position of this representation happens to agree with you that we cannot tinker around with it, because when you said something about the 1935 Constitution, certainly the Americans tinkered with that. Certainly, and you can accuse me of something else if you like, certainly those aspiring for the presidency at that time wanted us to be free at a certain time in 1946. And at that time, President Quezon, maybe other leaders wanted to make sure that history is being made, that they were part and parcel of ushering a new country with a new constitution, and that they were laying the predicate so that they could be the first president, if you like, or the first Congress, if you like. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the Constitution is a very, very sensitive matter that I think people don't realize in this country, that once we tie ourselves to it, our hands are tied, even in terms of foreign policy, in terms of even war making. And so, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make that manifestation to make it clear that their position is that it's not timely at this time. And then maybe the Congress can come out and debate about the matter of timing, or perhaps the philosophical arguments that we can put. I personally don't think when you start putting economic policies, those are ephemeral subjects. What is important are the basic fundamental things that people believe in. Freedoms, etc., protection, peace and order, protection of national security, and the natural resources. And natural resources are not exactly economic. They pertain to the sovereignty of our country, the right of our country to exploit ourselves for the posterity of the nation. On that note, Mr. President, I will stop now because I think I've spoken enough. And thank you, my esteemed Professor Mendoza, for your kindness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Gordon. On the dot, your 10 minutes is up. We now have Senator Marcos. Senator Marcos, you have the floor. You can proceed with your 10 minutes of questions. Go ahead.
Well, I think I will forego. I am intent on listening to all the different opinions. If there is someone who is ready.
Senator Pimentel, please, you have the floor. You have 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Chairman, thank you. My intervention will be brief. Did any of the resource persons take the position that the process is voting jointly?
None.
Kung wala, di wala po akong tanong tungkol doon.
None of, if I recall, none of the resource persons took the position that the Congress must vote jointly.
Voting separately.
So it looks like a consensus is developing already on how to interpret or read the constitutional provision on the amendment. The minority leader wants to.
Yes, just before Senator Pimentel came in, I asked for along those lines. I said my impression is that the position of the ILG and the Department of Justice is that we must vote separately. They confirmed, yes, that is their position. And the next question I asked is that the position of the executive branch? They could not respond, although the DOJ representative said that is the position of the DOJ secretary. Just for the information of Senator Pimentel, I asked that the Solicitor General, who will represent the respondent in case this is brought to the Supreme Court, be invited to the next hearing because he has taken the position in a number of instances that he is the tribune of the people and therefore is free to take any position. We would like to hear his views, and I request that they be invited at the next hearing, just for the information.
With permission of Senator Pimentel, just to follow up on that issue earlier, no?
Go ahead, Senator Recto.
Yes, thank you. Is it a requirement under the Constitution that both chambers meet as one in a constituent assembly? In one house, for example, and debate the issues together but vote separately? Maybe our research.
Justice Mendoza touched on that earlier. Go ahead, Justice Mendoza, you may respond.
Yes. It seems to me there is a little confusion here. When Congress meets, that's it. That means they meet separately. They always vote separately. So there's no question there. The question of voting separately arises precisely because the Constitution requires them to meet in a joint session and while meeting together in answering or resolving questions. How should that assembly assemble jointly vote? And that is where the question arises. And it is settled. They should vote separately in Congress while they are meeting as Congress. But the question is, should they also vote separately while sitting together as members of a constituent assembly? And my point is, yes, because one is smaller than the other, but that they should meet together and talk together face to face. That is the problem. And I think they should really meet together because they are meeting as an assembly of one.
Yes, Senator, the Minority Leader, you have the floor. You're raising your hand.
With all due respect to Justice Vivi Mendoza, unlike the Constitution preceding the present Constitution, the phrase in joint session assembled is missing. In other words, in the previous Constitution, before Congress would exercise its functions as a constituent assembly, the Constitution then requires in joint session assembled. That is the reason why we must have a joint session. In the absence of that phrase joint session assembled, the view has been proposed that in fact we can meet separately as a constituent assembly. There is nothing that would prevent the constitution of a constituent assembly with two houses. There is nothing that would prohibit that. In other words, in the same manner that you can have Congress with two separate houses, you can have a constituent assembly with two separate houses. In fact, it has been proposed, and I was among those who made that proposition. Amendments can be proposed separately, and provided the required vote is achieved separately in order to guard against runaway runaway assemblies, as warned by the good justice, and also to preserve the nature of Congress being consisting of two houses. So I repeat, the phrase "in joint session assembled" is not in the present constitution, and therefore we need not meet jointly to perform our task as a constituent assembly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senate Commissioner Monsod, and then Justice Mendoza. Go ahead, Commissioner Monsod. You have to unmute your mic.
I agree with Father Bernas that they should consider joint assembly because it would also help the people understand what's going on rather than shifting from one station to the other with the arguments back and forth, one to the House, one to the Senate. Here, there should be, I think, for information of the people and all the arguments are set in order, should consider a joint session. I think we earlier mentioned that there was really an oversight of the Constitutional Commission because of that one vote difference in unicameral versus bicameral, and we forgot to put everything. I think that if we did not make the oversight mistake, we would have put in also in joint session assembled, but voting separately.
Thank you. Justice Mendoza, please go ahead.
Yes. This is explained on page 5 of my paper, but let me just tell you this now. In the beginning, the Constitutional Commission thought of a unicameral legislature, one body only. But towards the end of its sessions, when there were only a few days left, the Commission decided to go bicameral for a bicameral Congress. And so all the provisions of the constitutions bearing or referring to a unicameral National Assembly were amended accordingly. I enumerated the several provisions of the Constitution which requires that when Congress is not performing non-legislative functions, it is required to meet in joint session and vote separately. Now, the amending clause, however, escaped the attention of the Commission, and this is very clear from the record of the Constitutional Commission. Chairman of that provision on amendment of the Constitution, now Article 17, Mr. Suarez expressly said that if the decision is to provide for a bicameral Congress, the phrase "in joint session assembled" should always be there, except that through oversight, they failed to insert this provision in the amendment clause of the Constitution. That explains the absence of this, and that is why I said at the beginning, this has become a vexing problem. There are really two questions, Mr. Chairman. Should Congress meet in joint session assembled? And number two, if they meet in joint session, how should they vote separately? It's now unanimously agreed. But the question of meeting jointly is the one that is giving rise simply because of the absence of this phrase, which was in the 1935 Constitution when we had a bicameral Congress. But only oversight accounts for the absence in the amending clause. That's very clear. Now, why will you require this provision in all the non-legislative functions of Congress, but omit it in amending the Constitution? There is no reason for that. So, two reasons. It has been provided whenever Congress performs non-legislative functions. Number two, it is only through oversight that this phrase in joint session assembled does not appear. So please don't look for it in Article 17 of the Constitution, because that is precisely begging the question.
And finally, with the permission of Senator Pimentel.
Go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, just to follow up on this issue, no? How is it done in the United States? We know that the US is a presidential system, a bicameral system of government also. How do they amend the Constitution in the United States? Do they meet jointly and vote separately?
I'm not very sure, Mr. Senator, but I can tell you this. When the Congress, shortly before the war, met to amend the Constitution to change the term of office of the president from 4 years to 6 years, 6 years to 4 years with re-election. Number two, to establish, what do you call this? These constitutional commissions now, COA.
Yes. We're talking of the 1935 Constitution, no? Yes.
They met jointly.
Jointly.
Yes, and provided for those provisions.
And voted separately.
Voting separately.
So that is in our experience in the 1935 Constitution.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pimentel.
Thank you for the exchanges, which did not make us more confused. Actually, they enlightened some of our positions. My point is to pursue the subject matter. Although Justice Mendoza pointed out past practice by our legislature that they held a joint session but voted separately. My reading of the Constitution now is that if we agree to a joint session assembled, the default rule is if you are in a joint session, you vote as a body. So jointly, you vote jointly, unless the Constitution itself specifically states that you're a joint session assembled, voting separately. And that is not found in the amendment process. So if we now agree to a joint session, then we might be boxed into this general rule that once you're in joint session, then it's joint voting. So at any rate, I think it's I think no one has taken the position that it is separate voting. Hence, I go back to my earlier statement that it seems that there is now a developing consensus that that is the proper interpretation of the amendatory process in our Constitution, especially if we add now the input from the Senate President when he told us earlier that even Speaker Velasco and I think the chair of the Constitutional Revision Committee also take that position or that interpretation. So looks like it's it's voting separately. Now, the question now is, do we need to physically assemble as one body? Siguro the basic requirement would be to have one agenda, one common agenda, and then whether we will have to be physically together, that's no longer necessary because we all agree that it's voting separately. So parang ano na rin. So it's like parang in tax exemption yata. I think Mr. Chairman, parang ganon. If there is a law with a tax exemption provision, sabi ng Constitution, it must be approved by a majority of all its members. Pero we know that the meaning of that phrase, by a majority of all its members, since that is a law, ganun din, it's voting separately. So that would be my contribution to the discussion this morning, Mr. Chairman. So yung pagdating na dun sa pagdating na sa merits of the actual proposals, well, there will be a proper and better time for that, except that let me now highlight the suggestion of Justice Ascuna that although we will now try to the amendment on the economic provisions will now try to pass the obligation to provide the terms to the Congress. Still, the Constitution can retain one basic requirement by making it always present in the law, always read into the law, the requirement of reciprocity. Maganda po yun. Yun po yun. Bakit tayo masyado naman nagpapalamang sa ibang mga nationalities when they themselves will not allow Filipinos to also access their natural resources or to access part of their economy and establish businesses in their area. So that is a point that I will always remember when we now discuss the substance of the various proposals. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Senator Pimentel. Before I recognize Senator Poe, just very briefly, the concern raised by Senator Drilon, and that's why we will be inviting the Solicitor General in the next hearing, is that while it is true that the leadership in the House has provided for a position that it has to be voting separately when we do convene, should we do convene as a Constituent Assembly, there are members in the House who contest this. In fact, on record, Congressman Edsel Lagman believes it should be voting jointly, as well as Congressman Marcoleta. And therefore, we may find ourselves in a hypothetical situation that in the middle of a Constituent Assembly deliberation, the matter can be brought before the Supreme Court, questioning the issue of whether or not voting separately or jointly is the constitutional intent, number one. Number two, it is unfortunate because we invited Justice Carpio for today's hearing, but he had a conflict in his schedule because it was a subject matter of a column in the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the issue of voting jointly. And if I recall it correctly, he said, if this matter of voting separately or jointly is brought before the Supreme Court, he said he does not know how the Supreme Court will vote. So that is just for the record, Mr. President, and we're putting that into the records of our deliberations. We now recognize Senator Poe. You have the floor, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'm not a lawyer, unlike the chairman of this committee or the one who proceeded before me, our bar top-notcher. But I'd like to consider myself as a student in a way, and I'd like to be enlightened. just like many of our countrymen, were a bit apprehensive about this push, and especially at this time. I would like to ask, anyone who can answer. Initially, Senator Recto brought up the question about the 1935 Constitution, and he was saying at that time, both houses, if I'm not mistaken, convened jointly but voted separately. Am I correct?
Yes, that is correct, Senator Po, if I may reply quickly, because that was required in the 1935 Constitution. The Congress in joint session assembled may propose amendments to the Constitution. That phrase "in joint session assembled" is not in the Constitution today, and that's why I am of the belief that we need not have a joint session. With all due respect to Justice Mendoza, that's the clear language. That's the language of the present Constitution, and unfortunately, it is alleged that there is an error. Well, that error, it's whether or not it's true. The way the Constitution is phrased today, in contradistinction to the previous Constitution, the phrase "in joint session assembled" is not there, and therefore it strengthens the proposition that we need not assemble jointly. We can meet separately as a constituent assembly and have the required 3/4 vote to amend the Constitution. Thank you, ma'am.
So I thank you for the clarification to our minority leader. So, Mr. Chair, if it does not specifically say in this Constitution that we should convene jointly, it also does not say specifically in our present Constitution the phrase voting separately. Am I correct?
That is correct. In fact, the Constitution says the Congress, upon a vote of 3/4 of all its members, it didn't say whether it is voting separately or jointly. Although, of course, our legal experts here, constitutional commissioners, have said that the reference is it should vote separately.
So meaning, if we choose one phrase over the other in its interpretation, for example, we assert that in this Constitution it does not mention voting, convening jointly, but then we assert on the other hand that should we not convene jointly, we still vote separately, which is not in this Constitution. I know it's very confusing. That will really open up a lot of arguments depending on the intention of the lawmakers. For example, obviously, in terms of the numbers, and this is always the point of argument, is that we will be outnumbered should we vote jointly. So my question is this: as one of our resource persons said, not a resource person today, but in the column of Justice Carpio, he said, we'll never know the outcome should this be elevated to the Supreme Court. Poses a great danger also in terms of the process. My next point here is that the Congress or the lower house always asserts that they will only touch the economic provisions. I'm sorry I wasn't here earlier because I conducted my own hearing in the Public Services Committee, but I heard it was asked already that should we convene for this discussion, that the actual agenda may not necessarily be limited to one that was first expressed before convening. Like, for example, even if both houses agree, I don't know how, will it be a joint resolution, etc., on having just the focus on economic provisions? Would that be enough to ensure that no other provisions other than the economic provisions in the Constitution will be touched?
Well, earlier Senator Gordon raised that question, and the answer of Justice Mendoza is that once you go through that Constituent Assembly process, there is no prohibition as to what can be tackled, and therefore any and all items can be tackled in a Constituent Assembly theoretically.
So is there a cure? Because I'm one that believes that there are a lot in our economic provisions that need to be amended in order to spur growth and economic activity. But is there a remedy? Since I'm not a lawyer, as I mentioned, is there a remedy that we can do to regulate ourselves, legislate something that will compel us to limit our discussion to just the economic provisions?
Yes, if I may respond, the column of Justice Carpio provides, he suggests some proposals. The remedy being that Congress should first enact a law that will, if I may quote, to ensure that the House and the Senate and the House will vote separately, Congress must first enact a law prescribing that even if Congress convenes as a constituent assembly, the Senate and the House shall approve separately by 3/4 vote any proposed amendment to the Constitution. Of course, he's also it sounds like a warning. This law can be questioned before the Supreme Court, and if the law is affirmed as constitutional by the Supreme Court, then and only then can the Senate be assured that it will remain a co-equal body with the House.
Correct. So, Mr. Chairman, I agree with that because we can approve a law. On the other hand, it must still emanate from the House. So I guess we can see their intention clearly if they're supportive of really what they've been professing, which is voting separately. On the other hand, since it's not mentioned in the Constitution itself, there's that ambiguity. It can still be questioned if we can go against what was written in the Constitution as to the interpretation of voting separately or jointly. So, what I'm trying to say is that maybe now, do we have here members of the Constitutional Convention of 1986? Are they unanimous in their pronouncements that the intention of the framers at the time was really for both houses to vote separately? Because the intention of the law of the framers is usually what is taken into consideration when there's a vagueness in the wording of the law.
Yes, we have former commissioners Ascona, Monsod, and Florangel Braid who are here. Commissioner Monsod, you're raising your hand. Go ahead and please respond. Please unmute your mic. Thank you.
Commissioner Monsod, your mic is still off, sir.
All right. Yeah. You know, there were 48 commissioners and only about 12 or 13 are still alive. So as far as the commissioners who are still alive, I believe, and that they agree, we made a mistake. And that the intent is that there should be a separate vote.
So this is unanimous with the living members, with the living framers.
As far as I know, Commissioner Ascuna is here, and so is Commissioner Brave.
Would you be able to come up maybe with a resolution amongst yourselves clarifying the issue with statements on how you recount the discussions were at the time, why you may have omitted it inadvertently? That will help if there are further discussions on the matter, but a written resolution will certainly be a strong argument in favor of our interpretation.
That's a very good suggestion, ma'am. We will meet and we will talk about it. I'm almost sure that the two other commissioners here would agree.
Okay,
Thank you.
lastly,
Thank you very much.
I would also like to comment to Mr. Monsod. I see your technical person there helping you with your connection. It's Solita Monsod herself is the one fixing your technical connection. Okay, there was also a pronouncement by the president that aside, he didn't mention anything about the economic provision, or I think he was leaving it up to us. But his clear intent was the party list system. And Senator Drilon, our minority leader, was saying this does not necessarily have to go through the constitutional change that they were proposing in the House, but just an amendment in the party list law. So, number one, my question is, with the pronouncements of the House now, are they even considering amendments to the party list system, or are they just now saying it will be purely about the economic provisions? And number two, is it would the experts here agree that a reform in the party list system did not necessarily need a constitutional amendment? So the
Yes.
first question.
Yes. Actually, the mention of the party list was an offhand remark of the president, but the purpose in which he said it was that he just wanted to get rid of the communists in the party list elections. I believe that there need to be changes in the party list. The latest decision of Justice Carpio is the closest to the intent of the Constitution. But I think there are three things that must be changed. One is the limit of 3, because the party list system is a proportional system of representation. So there should be no limit of 3. Number 2, there should be an anti-dynasty provision in the law. You don't need a constitutional change for that. And number 3, in the Carpio decision, there was a loophole that the party list should be represented by somebody from the sector, and then added that, or an advocate with a record of advocacy. That's a loophole. And that's why there are so many political dynasties that are in the party list who live in Forbes Park. Number 4 is that the Carpio decision, I think, settled forever or for good the interpretation that the party list is only the marginalized and underrepresented poor. That is inconsistent with the wording of the constitutional provision itself.
Okay, sir, thank you for enlightening us. Although the discussion of that will be more extensive if there's a law proposing the amendment on the party list system, or maybe just an order from the COMELEC. My question, though, is that with the House pronouncement lately, they're just saying, maybe the chairman can help me. They're just saying that they will confine it to the economic provisions with no mention of the party list. Am I correct?
Yes.
I think so. Yes.
Okay. And then also, just to clarify with the minority leader, with the permission of the chairman, the minority leader said that with regards to the party list reform bill, that can be done actually without going through the entire constitutional amendment of both with both houses convening. Am I correct, minority leader?
I'm not sure if he's online now, but I would confirm that I have read his public statement, and it's consistent with your earlier question and my statement.
Okay, lastly, as a concerned citizen, with what we're going through now, I would like to ask maybe the DILG, or I don't know who, with the suggestion of our chairman. Do you think that the matter is of grave importance, that this is something that we need to tackle at this point, especially that we are now fast approaching a national election in 2022? So maybe Yusek Malaya can answer.
Is Yusek Jonathan Malaya? Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we mentioned, Mr. Chairman, our position during the earlier part of the presentation, wherein we mentioned there that based on the consensus of the economic managers, Secretary Dominguez, Secretary Lopez, and all of the members of the inter-agency task force, that it is crucial for the country at present to be able to open up the industries as a measure to rev up the economy after the loss we have sustained
thank you,
because of the global pandemic.
Yes,
and then
Yusek
yesterday's
Malaya.
hearing, Mr. Chairman, of the
Yusek Malaya, you're a bit choppy, but let me interrupt you respectfully. I know what the economic managers are professing. On the other hand,
Japanese Chamber of Commerce that it would increase foreign direct investment
okay, but here's the thing.
and would
Yusek Malaya, Yusek Malaya,
able to open up the economy.
Yusek Malaya, I'm sorry, but you're choppy. We will first give the floor to, until you, let's see if you'll get a better signal. We'll first give the floor to Senator Poe.
Yes, with all due respect, I know what the economic managers are saying, but there are also business groups, if I'm not mistaken, that have also expressed their concern about the timing of this bill, of this action. I'm sorry. Now, when it comes to supporting our economy, at least in the Senate and in the House, we've done a few things already for that. And if I may, of course, the passing of the FIST bill, the Financial Institution Strategic Transfer Act. Right now, we have the bicameral meeting for the CREATE bill, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but which was spearheaded by the hardworking senator from Taguig, Pia Cayetano, that was also passed, at least in both houses. We will have the the AMLA bill that was passed. We have the guide bill that is now being proposed. We have the Public Service Act, which will change, that will redefine foreign ownership restrictions in the country. All these things have been done or are doable without having to resort to a constitutional amendment for the economic provisions. And if I may be candid, one of the reasons why the PSA has stalled is number one, there has been no certification for the passage of the Public Services Act as opposed to the other bills that were presented to both houses. Number two, and rightly so, many of our colleagues now are a little bit wary about passing or easing the restrictions on foreign ownership because of certain relations we have with other countries that might dominate ownership in the country. Now, we cannot say that this is an unfounded reason. I am for easing foreign ownerships, although you can understand the ambivalence of some or the objection of others because of some countries that have interests in our country. So, with that, Mr. Chairman, I would just like to say that I would like to ask one last question. If we tackle this now, for example, we both agree to convene for a constitutional assembly, realistically, how long will it be for us to pass? Wouldn't this have to go through a plebiscite? Meaning, in 2022, all of those proposed changes, Mr. Chair, will have to be subjected to a plebiscite. Am I correct?
That is correct.
So meaning, the laws that we have now, for example, they all of a sudden, for some reason, a provision on term limits will be changed. Those that will win in 2022, will they already be subjected to that if, let's say, the provisions in the constitutional amendments were ratified by the public?
I do not think so, because if they were elected under the 1987 Constitution, then their terms will be covered by the 1987 Constitution. And if the plebiscite is coinciding with the 2022 elections, then it will be the succeeding elections that will be covered by the approved amendments, assuming it is approved.
Thank you for the clarification. Now, Mr. Chair, here's an argument before I close. The House is saying that this is important because of the economic provisions. I agree with the intention that we need to strengthen some of our laws in order to boost our economy. On the other hand, there are bills already in place, like the Public Service Act, that will address some of the concerns or some of the provisions that we would like to amend from the Constitution. or from the laws that we already have. Now, if their argument will be this, but the Public Service Act might be questioned through the Supreme Court because of the constitutional maybe conflict about the definition of ownership. But even if we go through all of these exercise, there is no guarantee that it will not also be questioned in the Supreme Court. So what I'm saying is, at this time when there are a lot of concerns in the public and we already have bills in place that might help boost our economy, I think that it is a more realistic and less contentious goal to look at that route first before going through the entire exercise of a constitutional amendment supposedly for economic provisions. That's all, Mr. Chair, unless Senator Cayetano, whose hand is raised, might object to my analysis.
No, I'm not objecting, but with the permission of Senator Grace Poe and the chair and the body, I just like to interject because she mentioned my name and create, no?
Go
So
ahead.
it's aligned with her topic.
Go ahead.
May I?
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I totally agree with Senator Grace Poe's statement about the work that has been done on economic provisions. The lady has spearheaded AMLA and on FIST, and we have moved that forward. And as she pointed out, it is this representation that spearheaded CREATE. And so I echo in a way what I'm hearing from her, that when we passed CREATE, and this was the latter part of November 26th to be exact, the House had already passed their version of CITIRA. And that whole time, they had been through the chairperson of my counterpart in the House, the chairperson of Congressman Joey Salceda, had manifested that they would be adopting the Senate version because they know that we had numerous and very lengthy debates and included all sectors in the preparation of the finalization of this bill. So it's been 2 months, dear colleagues. Now, I've said this on the floor, but now that we have our esteemed resource persons here, I feel like they should be part of the record. Now, it's taken 2 months. It's past 2 months, and the House has not been able to. They decided not to adopt the Senate version, and I actually received informally a 57-page matrix of changes they want in CREATE. I can just imagine what these economic provisions are going to be about. I mean, seriously, 57-page matrix on the changes of the CREATE that I think all my colleagues will be able to stand by the fact that hinimay naman natin ng todo-todo yun. So that is the reality that will be confronting us, as pointed out by Senator Grace, and I wanted to put that on the floor, on the table, so that you are aware, because this is reality. And one last point I want to raise, though, yesterday they said that they may be amenable to reducing it to like 3 items because the Senate has pretty much taken a stand na sobra na yan. So ideally, but I mean, this is what's going to go on. So I just wanted to share that, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Grace. I think she wanted to add also something.
Thank you,
Chair, in
Senator
closing.
Cayetano. Go ahead, Senator Poe.
Mr. Chair, in closing, first of all, I'd like to actually acknowledge I've seen how the proponent for the CREATE bill in the Senate has really worked hard on this. I really marvel at how she's able to stand endlessly, I think, for 8 hours. I don't know if this is part of her workout regimen, but really to physically and mentally be sharp for that long. So I know that we really with our clean conscience, we really deliberated on this. And thank you for putting in perspective that the CREATE, one aspect of the economy, okay, when it comes to taxes, took that long to deliberate, and not even done because the House has a lot of disagreeing provisions. What more something like this? So panghuli na lang po, paalala lang sa atin na siguro ay naghihikayat magkaroon ng constitutional amendments at sinasabi na baka questionin yung voting separately. Kung yun nga, sinabi nga na natin paulit-ulit, kung yun nga ang mga pagpapapangalan ng mga karsada, o pagpapalit ng mga pangalan ng mga eskwela, tayo ay bumuboto ng hiwalay sa mga ganyang bagay lamang. Ngayon pa kaya na mismo ang ating konstitusyon ang apektado ay bigla na lang magiging iba ang ating paggawa ng batas. So yun lamang po, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our resource persons and for enlightening us today.
Thank you, Senator Po. Senator Cayetano, go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chair, would it be okay for me to make a few more comments? I am not sure if there's a line, if I can proceed.
Yes, you're next. Go ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead.
thank you. Actually, this is still in continuation with the earlier statements of Senator Grace Poe. I just wanted to emphasize that when I first heard, and we were actually still on a Christmas break, no, when I was going to proceed with the hearings or discussions on the proposed revisions of the constitutional provisions on the economic provisions. Honestly, the first thought that entered my mind, and of course the basis for that is, you know, to uplift the lives of Filipino, to make business easier to transact in the Philippines, to invite foreign investors, etc., etc. But I need to put on record that that could easily be the first step. There would have been create. If that is the objective, the first thing that could have been done was to pass create. I mean, we have all the support, not just from the finance team, the economic team of the government, but also from foreign chambers, that they now support the version of create. So that would have been the first step. So it's not for me to judge what the objectives of the House is or was, but if that was the objective, to improve the economic conditions, this is what could have happened. And it could have happened right away, because for the information of those just tuning in, corporate income tax would have dropped immediately from 30 to 25%. And for SMEs earning less than 5 million, 20%. How much better does it get than that, no? And for foreign investors, we've broadened, we've clarified the incentives that are available to them. I think most of our colleagues were quite happy with the more liberal and generous incentives that we provided, which are competitive with our Asian neighbors. So that really would have been the easy step. So I cannot help but wonder, if that is the objective, then why could this first not be taken? Having said that, anyone who wants to react, Mr. Chair, can react. No, I'm just tossing it all out there. Just going back to the statements of our esteemed resource persons, I noted earlier that Justice Mendoza did specifically state that, for the record, what was contemplated by the commissioners at that time was a unicameral system. And so when this was changed in the end, very simply put, and these are my words, not his, some amendments to certain provisions were not made. Mr. President, Mr. Chair, all of us as legislators can understand that, no? The train law, the create law, ang daming housekeeping yan. It's one provision that affects so many others. So did I hear it clearly? And I'm not sure if Justice Mendoza is still with us, but maybe the chair can just confirm.
Justice Mendoza is still here.
There, Justice Mendoza. So very simply put, it was overlooked to clarify that it is voting separately. That it should have been voting separately when we shifted, when the draft shifted from a unicam back to a bicam scenario. That's clearly is that what you said? Because I actually missed it. I just heard that is what you said, that there was that shift, and in all likelihood, certain provisions were not amended. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I wanted to hear it from you.
Go ahead, Justice Mendoza.
Yeah, that's a provision that has no answer to two questions. First, when sitting as a constituent assembly, how should Congress sit jointly or separately, meaning to say the House at the Batasan and the Senate at the Reclamation area. And number two, if they meet together as one body, how should they vote? Separately or jointly? Because if you have Congress meeting separately, there is no question that the voting is always separate. So if you agree that voting required is voting separately, it must be because Congress is required to sit in a joint session together. Number two, this was just a question of oversight on the part of the Constitutional Commission that framed the present Constitution. This was admitted by no less than Commissioner Suarez, a member of the Constitutional Commission, because he said that in all other provisions of the Constitutions, which I pointed out, all pertaining to the non-legislative functions of Congress, Congress is required to meet, number one, in a joint session, and number two, when voting, to vote separately. You're going to discuss such fundamental question as the economic provisions of the Constitution. The Constitution, I pointed out, provides for an independent, self-reliant national economy controlled by Filipinos. You're going to liberalize that. Don't you think that it is wise and prudent if the two houses of Congress should meet jointly so that they can discuss the question regardless of status, whether as senators or congressmen, but simply as members of a constituent assembly? It is better that they break bread together than leaving simply any differences that they might have if they voted separately to a BICAM. What is better than the Congress as a whole meetings jointly rather than leaving these matters of disagreements to a BICAM? The members of the assembly can discuss freely, face to face. So there's every reason for requiring that they meet jointly. And there are 5 provisions in the Constitution which require really that they should meet jointly and separately vote. So it's not an error, it's simply oversight to make the same amendment that they made in other provisions, put this in the same, meaning to say the phrase joint session assembled, put this also in Article 17. Senator Grace Poe said, 2 questions are not in the Constitution. How should they vote? Number 2, how should they sit? If there is agreement that they should vote separately, even though that's not in the Constitution, what is the hesitation for voting or meeting separately, which is also not in the Constitution, but admittedly a question of oversight on the part of those who wrote the Constitution?
Thank you, Justice Mendoza.
Thank you so much, Justice.
Go ahead, Senator P.
No, I was also just saying thank you to my former professor. I continue to learn a lot from his wisdom.
Our former professor.
Our. Although hindi yata tayo sabay na classmate sa kanya, no? But I have very fond memories of being in his class. and I'm so happy to see you here today, sir. Yeah, so that's actually what I wanted to point out, Mr. Chair, that I think any of us who has defended a complex bill, and sometimes it's not even that complex, and yet that belatedly our staff will remind us na, ay sir, kailangan palitan nyo to para consistent dun sa mga una. That happens to me so often, no? And that's why a bill like CREATE, we needed so much time to do the housekeeping because there were so many interrelated provisions, no, on basically the National Internal Revenue Code. So my point is similar to what Justice Mendoza was making, that there's an oversight here, but we can take our be guided by what was the intention and what is it that what foreseen in the drafting of the Constitution as a whole. My personal takeaway is that I don't have any strong feelings about sitting jointly or sitting separately, but I am listening carefully. I was listening carefully to Justice Mendoza about, hearing, going through the debates together. I have no issue about that. In fact, we end up repeating that. My colleagues and I all know that, when we have an important bill, separate hearings go on almost simultaneously. Sometimes our resource persons will say they're not available today because they're in the House. So I personally have no major issue with that. No? To me, it's really a matter of efficiency. But on the voting separately, we are two separate houses, then I feel strongly that that should have always been the interpretation. And I think Senator Kiko and I had our on this issue also, and I think there might be. I wanted to end by saying that perhaps the committee COMSEC can take a look at. I'm not sure. It might have been Senator Miriam. Do you recall, Senator Kiko? I think she had hearings on this also. Yes. But maybe I'm sure the COMSEC has records also of various resource persons who attended.
We will take a look at that, Senator Pia.
Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Senator Pia. Just on that matter of an oversight and the intent of the framers, we would also like to put on record one of the provisions, another provision in the Constitution that we felt then was there was an oversight in terms of representation, and because of the rush to pass or the amendment that led to a bicameral rather than a unicameral Congress, was the composition of the Judicial and Bar Council. The provisions in the Constitution provide just for one representative of Congress, when in fact, precisely the intent of the framers initially was a unicameral Congress and then shifted to a bicameral Congress, but forgot inadvertently to amend that particular provision on the JBC to provide for two members rather than a member of Congress. This matter was brought to the Supreme Court. I know this because I was with the Judicial and Bar Council for 8 years, but at that time, we interpreted the Constitution to provide for two representatives, one from the House and one from the Senate. And that was the practice until 2013, if I recall correctly, when the matter was brought before the Supreme Court and finally affirmed in 2017. And the Supreme Court ruled that there can only be one representative of Congress rather than two. So that might, again, be instructive in terms of how the Supreme Court may interpret what we felt to be an inadvertence, a failure to correct some provisions in the Constitution because of the shift, the vote by one, as manifested earlier and explained by Commissioner Monsod, a vote of one vote in favor of a bicameral Congress. So just for the record, we just wanted to put that on record. So the ruling of the Supreme Court in the representation of Congress in the JBC is that there can only be one So ang nangyayari ngayon, I think nag-alternate yung Senate at yung House. So when I feel that since it's an inadvertence, it should be two representatives, one from the House and one from the Senate. Anyway, that's just an obiter dictum, for lack of a better term, on this discussion. Therefore, with that, are there other questions from our members of the committee, our distinguished senators? Kung wala na, we can now proceed with the other matters. Just for the record, this is not the last hearing. We will proceed to a second hearing, and this time have a more lengthy discussion on the substance. Earlier, nagka-problema lang because the PCCI had poor connection, but we have discussed this with them and our committee secretary, and that they will submit their position. We are also requesting for those who have not submitted their official position papers to please submit them to our committee secretary. We also would like to place on record that there are position papers that have been submitted to us, even if they were not invited, and we welcome this, from the Kapatiran, ang Kapatiran Alliance for the Common Good, as well as Tanggulang Demokrasya or Tandem Incorporated. And we would like to also make it public and appeal to the public if they feel strongly about their positions on these issues, that we welcome position papers to be submitted to us. Unless there are other items, we can proceed to suspend this hearing, and we will call another hearing, and we will to be announced. With that, we would like to thank our colleagues for attending this session. We would like of the hearing rather. We would also like to thank our resource persons for this opportunity to hear your positions on the matter. And since there are no other items and there are no other matters to be attended to in this hearing, we are therefore suspending the hearing, and we will resume at a later date and at a later time. Thank you very much. Magandang hapon sa kanilang lahat at maraming salamat.